Plus, Ultra presents The Grey Lodge, Friday Night Gnostic Book Club, but usually it's Friday Night Gnostic Mass. But this is a special multi-part series. I said 3 parts, but I always tend to make more parts. So this will probably have more than 3 parts. But this tonight is part 2. We're doing Weizza, which is part 2 of our Sinister and Sorcerous Traditions of Southeast Asia series. We did part 1, Lurcy, which was on Thai, Esoteric Theravada, and witchcraft and sorcery and magical practices, really magical Buddhism. And we're going to be drawing a lot from that space. So if you have not listened to that, I would definitely recommend that you go and listen to that, so you have like a little bit of background of what are my main theses and where I want to go with it. Um, of course, we are basing this on a book. So our primary book, but there was really multiple texts, but it's the Thomas Patton book, Buddhist Wizards of, I think that's what it's called, Buddhist Wizards. Anyways, if you just look that up, Thomas Patton, Buddhist Wizards, he is the professor of religion at Chinese University of Hong Kong, which is like a important place for like the Center for Asia Studies. So for people like me who are interested in like area studies and sort of like multidisciplinary anthropology, that's a very important place to sort of like look for scholarship coming out of. So he's one of, and Burma is a pretty uncommon place for people to study, and especially this topic. So I am usually joined by our homies well, tonight I'm joined by Joshua, who is my co-host, and then also Solar Exile, who may or may not be here, and Eros to Ethos. She has her own YouTube channel, and so everybody can follow them. I'll let Joshua plug whatever he wants and say anything that he wants about this specific topic. If even if he doesn't have anything, at least he can plug and like set it up to in a place that I can go, I can like riff on, as we like to say, and then yeah, we'll start from there. Thanks, Josh.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for hosting. Um, well, I'm not familiar with the book or the author, but what comes to mind are some of the parallels that I've seen between like Christianity, esoteric Christianity, mystic Christianity, and Buddhism. And I think Tantra and, Sephira, Kabbalistic type workings are kind of where maybe the two kind of can be bridged. And at least that's my opinion. So I'm kind of excited to get into it and see if that is true, in fact.
Well, as I laid out in the first part, Lurcy, I think that absolutely it is clear that this is a tantric tradition. Interestingly, we had to talk a lot about Burma in the first parts because it is the entry point for tantra into Southeast Asia. It's like well documented. It came from Bangladesh, West Bengal, particularly, which is the sort of we call it the speculative crossroads that leads into Tibet or leads into Nepal. So Burma also borders China, Sichuan. It also borders Laos, Cambodia. Um, like it borders everything. So it is really a true crossroads. And actually, Burma used to be the biggest for a time in the 16th century. It was the biggest Southeast Asian kingdom of them all, and actually ruled substantive parts of what we now call India, including Assam, Orissa, and and I think Nagaland as well, which is an interesting name for a province that is in India. So it's also been always Theravadan Buddhist, so it's always had this kind of Buddhist tradition. What Theravada is now in the West and understood to be, I would posit that this is a different iteration of it, and it's a much older sort of substrate. But again, I will say it clearly is tantric. Now, if you are looking at tantra as just a formation in Tibet or Nepal, is it going to be exactly one to one? No, but it's very close to the original, maybe we'll say first to fifth century formations of tantra, where you have wandering masters, Vidyadhara. So let's start with the word etymology. Weizza. This is the Burmese word. Now, maybe you should start at language. Maybe we'll start that there first, at the fundamental primary word, right? Because the word is magic in Buddhism. So if we say that, we have to say Burmese is a very interesting language because it is Sino-Tibetan, which means it's distantly related to Tibetan and Chinese. Hey, Vanessa, what's up? We just had Truth and Dies. Vanessa, everybody check out her Etsy store. She's a member of our Grey Lodge. Our Grey Lodge is a book club. It's a group chat of Metamagicians, as well as just like an esoteric circle where we discuss metaphysical, speculative, and magical ideas.
I
Which
actually wore one of her tie-dyes today. So yeah, shout out to Vanessa.
Shout out Vanessa. So, okay, so it's Sino-Tibetan language, but Burmese writing is actually based on Brahmi script. Brahmi script is one of the oldest Indian scripts, like modern Indian scripts. What is special about Burmese is that they actually changed it from a square script into a circular script, specifically so they could write on palm leaf manuscripts. If you understand the history of Tantra, you will understand that the history of Tantra was written on palm leaf, as was a lot of the suttas, which are the sacred texts of Theravada Buddhism, but also a lot of Tantric and Mahayana scriptures as well were written on palm leaf. So it's an innovation that directly coincides with the greater conversion into Theravada Buddhism. But as I said, the multiple kingdoms that comprise modern Burma or modern Myanmar, they were all Theravada Buddhist. So you could say it's a civilization deeply tied into the history of Buddhism as well as the history of Southeast Asia. So I guess to differentiate it, what differentiates? Okay, so we'll do Weizza. Sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought. Okay, Weizza. So Weizza is the Burmese word. So Burmese has a lot of Pali. Pali is the language that the suttas are written in. So Pali is not the same quality in a Sanskrit conceptualization, a tantric conceptualization. Pali is not of the same quality as Sanskrit. It's a composite language. Okay, so that doesn't. It's not necessarily bad or good. I'm not saying it like that. I'm just saying that it is a composite language, but it is considered a sacred language for especially for this kind of Buddhism. So, but a lot of the words are very easy to understand with my like like basic Sanskrit like knowledge. Okay, so I will probably use more Sanskrit, and I'll use Sanskrit predominantly rather than Pali because I'm so unfamiliar with it. But anyways, the Weizza is the Burmese word for Vidyadhara. Vidyadhara. Okay, we talked about this last our first part. This just means wisdom master or wisdom scientist. Very, very common way to translate it. Vidya means wisdom, Dara means master. However, because of the British colonization of Myanmar or Burma, as it was called, they began to use the word wizard as a direct translation of Weizza. Now, some people might say that this is a sort of importation of colonialism, but there is an acute Burmese sensibility that is very anti-colonial as well as anti-Sinosphere influence. So we'll get into that later because actually is very important. The politics of Myanmar and Burma play a lot, at least the magical traditions play a large part in the politics of that region. And I think they always have. And I think this was also something that came up in the discussion of Thailand, how tied in the elite, especially the urban elite, but also the royalty, are to these kind of magical traditions. So yeah, so they actually love the word wizard. This is their preferred translation. Even according to Thomas Patton, and I read various other books, some anthropology from the 1930s. There is Cassandra. Cassandra is our tarot, astrology, and jewelry maker. Everybody check out Cassandra's Etsy as well as her own content. She makes her own content. So everybody check that out. And she is currently offering tarot readings. So take her up on that before that window closes. And she did happen to post on magic number 7:44 p.m. So magic. Anyways, so I totally forgot where I was, Joshua. Were you keeping track? I apologize.
Well, I'll just say she makes great gifts. I gave some to my niece for her birthday a couple of months ago, and she loved them. So yeah. Anyway, I can vouch for her gifts too. I've bought from her. Hey, but I did have a joke. So I was wondering if Vanessa has ever been to Thailand, tie dye. Anyway. So you were.
That's a good dad joke.
But you were talking about Burma and how the stuff was. Anyway, I don't want to derail you. I don't.
Oh no, I needed help with that because I sort of lost my point with Cassandra. I saw her chibi use of avatar, and I just totally, you know, it happens. Okay, so yes, the Weizza. So Weizza as a wizard. So we'll use that. We'll say wizard, right? That is their preferred term. They understand it to be the same. Now, it occupies a third position. So we talked about this again in the first part with Lurcy, how they occupy a third position. They are Buddhist, like they are Buddhist in their cosmology, ontology, and perhaps even ideological standpoint, but they are not. They are lay practitioners. So they have a different set of rules and they have a different set of practices than the monastics. This is kind of different from like the Thai Lurcy and the Burmese Weizza. They obviously those are the similar words even. A rishi and a Vidyadhara, there's an interrelationship in the Pali, okay, with Vidyadhara. But they sort of understand it to be slightly different. So a Weizza is kind of an arahant, what we would say in Mahayana, but it's a little more like a tantric actually, like a mahasiddha. That's more what it is. It's someone who gains supernatural power through specific practices, and we're going to get into. I'm going to go practical magic on this one. At least not practical for people to do, but practical as in like we'll explain what they're doing to get to where they want to go. So basically, yes, they do magical practices and within Buddhism, in a Buddhist framework. Now, this does not mean that they do not engage with necromancy, quote unquote black magic. We talked a lot about this the last space on Lurcy as well. Like what defines quote unquote black magic in a Southeast Asian frame? This is really interesting because this has been a point of contention when we've discussed it more broadly as a group, right? So, what distinguishes it, I'll just say it again, is the use of corpse material, carnal ground materials. In this kind of Tantra, if you are a Buddhist monastic, you do not use carnal ground materials at all. Do not tame ghosts, and you do not deal with those kind of lesser spirits. However, this is perhaps why the Weizza sort of are of a paramount popularity and necessity in Burmese society even today. And you could say the popularity of the Weizza cult, we're going to get into more of the definition of what that even is, but it's actually become more popular in the last 120 years than it ever was. So they deal with necromancy, black magic, but they also deal with healing. They also deal with like money, fortune. They also deal with fortune telling, astrology. Although there is an important distinction in like for Burmese, a Weizza can be a woman. This is very different than the Thai Lurcy. A Lurcy is only a man. And all fortune telling, astrology, and tarot cards, and sort of palm reading and face reading, this is also predominantly done by women or ethnic Chinese in Thailand. Sometimes ethnic Indians, depends. But generally, it's not a Lurcy or a Weizza. This is the same in that sense in Burma. But in Burma, a woman can also be a Weizza. So that is kind of interesting. But to become a Weizza is predominantly a Buddhist practice. And Thomas Patton and I slightly disagree on how to get there, but of course he's lived in Burma. I've never lived in Burma. So he has a different ethnographic subjectivity. Okay. But he believes that a lot of it, if you want to distill it down to its base element is this specifically Burmese Buddhist breathing method, which relies on the counting of breaths as the vehicle, which is a fundamental tantric proposition, the breath as the consort, the breath as the Shakti, the breath as the space between the words of the mantra. Yes, they do also recite mantras. They don't just recite Pali suttas, verses from their scriptures. They also recite specific magical spell incantations, which are often passed down or they're derived. There are formulations to derive them from the scriptures themselves. And I know this for a fact simply because there are Sanskrit formulations to derive mantras from texts as well. So there are ways that individual practitioners historically would be able to come up with actual mantras that are hidden in the text in Sambodhya Gaya or Twilight language. So it's very similar to this. So they would recite the mantras, not always, but it's very common, and maybe more privately than in a Tibetan context would have them. But this breathing method is very important, especially for the Thomas Patton book. He talks a lot about it. And he talks a lot about how Burmese Buddhism was a deep influence on the transcendental meditation practices that became popular in the 70s in the West. So, because of several teachers from Burma. So that's very interesting in a new age sort of like historiography of like magic in the sort of new aeon, you could say, this transcendental meditation, which of course has been secularized, which it is what it is. I don't really agree with that because I think that Buddhism is a complete system, especially when we're adding in this layer of Weizza or sorcery. So there are multiple other ways. So it requires a lot of discipline because you have to specialize in specific yanas or paths. So we did discuss this obviously in regards to Lurcy. We talked about metallurgy. We talked about Buddhist herbalism, which is a big part of how they understand Buddhist magic to work. Buddhist magic is primarily made of herbs and metals. And Thai Lurcy is predominantly metals and corpse ground material. So, you have the overlap with the metallic substances, the very alchemical, very like primordial sort of metallurgical knowledge with different sort of ontological positions or cosmological positions. One is situated within the monastery, and one is situated within the quote unquote carnal ground. Now, of course, just like in Thailand, Burmese monasteries traditionally have been in charge of cremation. So there are cremation stupas also on the grounds of the monastery. So really, where is the liminal space, the border between the monastic, the sacred, and the profane? And I mean profane and not just in the desecularized or desacralized way. I mean it specifically as in carnal ground, transgressive, antinomian. Those places are the same, or at least they have an interrelationship and they also occur on the same ground, very literally. So then you will say, well, then how can they distinguish it? Well, they do. So we're going to go with their understanding, whether that is we agree with that or not. I think it's useful in this like speculative anthropological way to just look at it as a kind of their distinctions have a reason and maybe a traditional sort of framework for why they classify corpse ground materials as black magic. Okay, so basically, Weizza might view metallurgy. We talked again, discuss this a lot. A lot of this has to do with quicksilver, the sort of preparation of what we would call in Tibetan sotel. Is so important for Burmese magic and Weizza and becoming a Weizza. But in the contemporary time, people are rightfully afraid of consuming and preparing mercury, which I obviously am not suggesting in any way for people to play with or to do. We're just talking about historical practices. So that is traditionally one way. Another one is the study of everyone's favorite topic, and I think this is the whole reason why people even were interested in this series to begin with, is the Burmese yants, the magical sigil making and magical tattooing. So we also discuss this, of course, because we could not discuss it in the Lurcy section, because you often see Muay Thai fighters, both Western and Thai, ethnic Thai, covered in Thai magical tattoos. Interestingly, Burmese magical tattoos are considered to be the most powerful of all magical tattoos. So, but they're also the rarest, just like Burmese amulets are the rarest, because Burma, for a long time, has been under military junta. Now, they did have a coup in 2020, and this will play a really important part of when we get into the factionalization of the Weizza and sort of their meta-political goals, and, like, if you want to call them the wizards of the deep state, who they are and what they stand for. But we'll talk about that a little later. First, we're going to define more specifically what a Weizza is. So, a Weizza really is, as I said, it is a wizard, but it is someone who has gained the one of the at least one of the 13 greater or Maha cities, the 13 greater powers that are found in Pali suttas, as well as apocryphal texts, as well as Mahayana texts, as well as tantric texts. Now, there are different lists of cities, and it's very clear to me that the Burmese do have tantric, more tantric, like aligned with like deeper tantric ideas. They have also have those, not just like the Indian sort of outer normative understanding of them. So yeah, sigil making is a big part of it. But another way to become a Witza is through spirit intercession, which is very different than Thai Lursi. So a Witza is a saint, very, very literally. They consider them wizard saints. This is even how Thomas Patton's first translator translated the Burmese word, Weizza. He said it's a wizard saint, a Buddhist wizard saint. That's verbatim from the book. And as I referenced in other books, this actually seemed to be a common understanding. So again, it relates to Mahasiddha, it relates to the Arahants of Mahayana Buddhism, but it also relates to, obviously, my show is called Threshold Saints, and this is a Grey Lodge space. So it's all in, there is a kind of interesting correlation that I find, that I'm obviously kind of obsessed with. So I thought that was interesting. So, but they're not always saint-like. So you see the character I have up on screen. His name is Bo Mingguang. Obviously, I am Chinese, so anytime I pronounce Burmese, I don't speak Burmese, so I'm going to pronounce it in just my Chinese way. But he is the most important of the wizard saints of the 20th century. He died in, I think, 1957 or 1967. I cannot remember right at the second, but he is considered to be the most important, if not the he's not necessarily the most powerful or the top of the pantheon, but he is a wizard who was said to, when he died, he actually entered peri-nirvana. So this is very different than the usual Theravadan way to describe death, to describe like how one enters a higher mind stream or how one enters into a bodhisattva sort of pure land. This is what he is said to have done. It's said that he gained multiple of these cities in life, and so when he died, he actually did not go back into samsara directly. He actually became like an elevated kind of ascended master. I'm using that very loosely, figure, because this is not quite the Buddhist way of understanding of the spirit and the self and all of that. We won't necessarily get into that, but I think it's interesting and important to sort of distinguish. But I'm going to use that framing because I think it's okay. So he becomes a kind of ascended master, as do all the Weizza. So these are all Buddhist wizard saints who sort of postpone their own samsaric reincarnation or transcend it. So both of those understandings are perfectly valid. So he becomes a wizard and then he appears to people in dreams, as do many of them. But he is not considered to be the most important in terms of spiritual power or renown. He actually had a very negative reputation in life for being quite volatile and for being a little bit abusive and like verbally abusive, and for being, rich people would come to him and he would curse them. if they asked for foolish things. If poor people came to him and they were like very petty minded, he would turn them away. He was not the typical kind of what people in the West think of like as a Buddhist, or especially a Theravadan Buddhist. He was compassionate to the sick and poor, and he was helpful to people who wanted to better their rebirth. But they don't necessarily think of these things in specific class distinctions like how we sort of do in post 20th century. So he was just a volatile personality, and it's important to note that because he is still propitiated as a wizard saint, so truly a saint, with alcohol, with money, with cigarettes. He was a big smoker. This was something that was a point of contention because a lot of the monasteries and the monks recognized him as a great wisdom master, a great Vidyadhara, a great wizard, but they did not approve of his lifestyle. So this is also something to note, is that a lot of the Weizza have very unconventional, not unconventional as in like modern Western unconventional lifestyle, but they do not necessarily live by the, strict Buddhists. Even the lay Buddhists have a very much stricter kind of like rule set that they follow. By the time someone becomes a Weizza, they take on sort of this supernatural aura, to use a Twitter X word, that we often discuss in the group. And so he's kind of transcendent of the rules in some ways. And this is also true for Tantra. Like this is also true for Central Asian Tantra, is that, like Naropa. Naropa, I forgot which writer, but some writer describing Naropa in his late 50s, he was, he basically the monastery supported him financially, and so they carried him out on a dais, like a palanquin, like a elevated raised platform that can be carried by the monks. The monks carried him out. On the platform was platters of meat. So the monastics were not allowed to eat this at that time. They also had tons of alcohol. This is also against the monastic rules, but the monastery was also funding and providing them. But even more importantly, who joined Naropa on this dais or palanquin? The Skywives. So he had multiple Dakini consorts who came from various castes, including Chandalis, who come from the outcast. They're village or tribal people, like ethnic tribal people. So this is also plays important into the discussion of Burma, like modern Burma, or modern Myanmar, excuse me, but also historical Burma. Burma is and has always been a multi-ethnic polity, as it covered a huge amount of territory, and not everyone is closely related, and not everyone is within the same Sino-Tibetan ethno-linguistic language family. But what is really interesting is that the tribal people of Burma are largely Theravadins themselves, or practice what is called Nat worship. So we have to discuss that. That is going to be a big part of tonight. What is Nat worship, and why is it not so much part of the urban Weizza tradition, but more so the tribal and the rural Weizza traditions? But before we get into that, let's talk about Bomingguang a little more. So he represents one of dozens of Buddhist wizard saints. We can assume that there have been many, many over the last 1,500 years, but there are specific names that have more prominence. But as I said, the cult really, really, really took off as specifically a Weizza devotional cult, meaning devoted to the Weizza themselves, not just to the Buddhist tradition of becoming a Weizza, like not just the practice of magic, but actually the veneration and enshrinement and elevation into the pantheon of these Buddhist wizard saints. So direct intercessory, sort of a direct intercessory cult, where they are able to come to people in dreams. I was trying to say this before, but I didn't quite get there. But a way to become a Weizza is through the direct intercession of one of the known Weizza, one of the famous or infamous Weizzas. So a lot of people will say that they are mediums of a specific Weizza. Bomingguang is just one, but there are multiple others, of course. or they will say they received direct teachings from him in a dream, or they were said to were told by him an apparition to go study at a certain temple or make a pilgrimage to a certain temple. Or he sometimes heals illnesses, and then he will say, you have to now become a Weizza. So this is very common. If you've read any Joseph Campbell book, it's like a very common, like the sort of healer's journey, the shaman's journey. It's very similar to that, but it's a little different because instead of it just being a do what you will or do as you want path, it is very much about doing the specific Buddhist practices that can get you there. So this also goes back to the point that Joshua made at the very beginning about the relationship between Tantra, Kabbalah, and all wisdom traditions. So if you've listened to the Grey Lodge and all of our other series and all of our other spaces, you will know that I do believe that there is a axial or primordial magical system or wisdom science. I would rather call it wisdom science. And it comes from Central Asia. So if you imagine Central Asia as sort of emanating these spokes or rays on a wheel that is always constantly in motion, and the rays represent actually knowledge rather than anything supernatural necessarily, it makes sense. And if you look at Burma's location and where Burma used to rule and how big the kingdom is and how much territory it occupies still, and what an important sort of geographic positionality. It covers one half of the Bay of Bengal is Burma or Myanmar. So a major trading port for the Dutch and the British. So, and also like as we discussed last week, or not last week, but the week before, the British were very interested in Tantra. The British were in they were also in Kathmandu studying Tantra, but primarily they were in Calcutta studying Tantra. So Calcutta is directly across the bay from Myanmar. So that's also very interesting to me. And so we also know that the Tara Tantras come from West Bengal, at least part of them. So you're going to say, well, Theravada doesn't really have the same goddesses or any goddesses. Well, this is where we have to get into Nat worship. Who are the Nats? The Nats are a mixture. They're a syncretic blend of spirits. I'm going to pull up the picture that I had previously. Goodbye, Bo Ming Guang. Please bless this space. This is Sri Devi Chandi. So if you've listened to Saints or you've listened to the Grey Lodge, you've definitely heard this name before. It is the Hindu Buddhist goddess Chandika. She's a Nat, one of the 37 Nats. So in previous times, there were hundreds or perhaps even thousands of Nats, and they are a mixture of different spirits. Some are Hindu, some are Vedic. Yes, you heard me right. Indra is also worshipped as the head of the pantheon of Nats. Now you will ask, why is that? You posited that Burma was always a Theravadan Buddhist place, and it has been. It always has been since the formation of the Pagan Empire. But prior to that, it certainly was part of the greater Hindu Buddhist sort of syncretic religion that covered all of Southeast Asia and probably all of West India or Western India. I guess it's not really Western India. Sorry, it's Eastern India. My apologies. Bengal is in Eastern India, but not just Bengal. Assam, Nagaland, which is tribal, Kashmir, of course, all of these places. These places were very syncretic, largely Buddhist, but they had some of the Indian deities. This is perfectly acceptable because the Pali Suttas describe the Vedic gods as laying down and worshiping at the historical Gautama Buddha's feet. There's a famous festival. It's celebrated as the Tushita Heaven Day. I forgot what it's even called, but it's when the historical Buddha ascends on the ladder, 33-rung ladder, to the heavens to teach for 33 more days the Devas, the Vedic Devas, Dharma, but Buddhist Dharma, not just Vedic Dharma. So he teaches them the Dharma, and so they become from that teaching, whether they accept it or not, the seed of Dharma is planted within them, and they become they become at least a part of the Marga. So with that being said, it makes perfect sense why some people would worship Indra. You see this in Thailand. We talked about this. Brahma, Ganapati, Rahula, all of these figures, like the mixture of Puranic, Upanishadic, and Vedic figures. So Chandika is not necessarily a Vedic figure at all. In fact, she's not. She's an Upanishadic figure at oldest, but she probably represents the oldest kind of Hinduism. So what we now call Hinduism is best the oldest version of which the oldest practical version, meaning that the temples that worship Durga or Chandika, because that's both, but one name has a deeper significance. But those temples represent the oldest sort of living tradition, and they only date back to the first century. So when we're talking about Hinduism, despite what people may say on Twitter or the internet, it's much more recent than how people understand it. That isn't to say that the Vedic elements aren't part of it, but it's not really, because these things have all been syncretized, brought into other systems, remixed, re-understood. There's obviously Sambodhya Gaya, Tantric, Twilight language layers. So you have all of these influences. So this is basically Chandika. Usually Chandika is depicted as riding a lion. You see here she's riding a royal duck, but it's actually not a duck. It's actually a phoenix. We won't get into that, but it's very significant. But this kind of duck Burmese sort of bird figure was at one time the symbol for the royal family of whatever, I forgot the dynasty, from the 17th century. So it perfectly it's fine to depict her like that. So basically, the 37 knots are spirits of various types. So I'm saying Indra, that's a Vedic slash Buddhist deity. Then you have Chandika, who is obviously Cassandra is doing her bird. We'll call it bird tarot. We won't give anything away, but yes, quack. So they are a various spirits. So Chandika is a Puranic and Tantric goddess. That's what I'm saying, Tantric. So that's really interesting to me because the goddess tantras are also probably the most are probably the oldest, and they're probably the most fundamental. Now, some people will fight me and say, no, the Bhairava tantras are the most important. Well, as we discussed in the Lursi spirit or the Lursi space, the Bhairavas do make a very important appearance in Southeast Asia as the P Bhairav. So they exist one to one. Now, the traditional continuity, is that the same as the Indian traditional practices? No, but you have to also admit that the Indian practices of the Bhairavas died out. So, anyways, so going back to the knots. So, some knots are actually mountain spirits, and some knots are actually household gods. So, meaning that, like, the god of the hearth, the god of the kitchen, the god of like the latrine, the god of the god of children. So, like, minor gods, minor village deities, kind of animistic gods. Some of those are gnats. And so you have a variety of spirits, and then you also have royal historical figures, meaning that they are enshrined and deified historical or dramatic figures from Burmese plays or literature. One thing that is important, since we talked about Burmese language, I think to note is that Burma has always had an extremely high literacy. It's always been above 50%. So you must admit that probably Burmese has very magical elements. Just not just because it's a Brahmi script, not just because they changed it specifically to write yantras or magical sigils, or even Buddhist textual language, which of course has its own magic. But I think that we could also say that, Burmese in general is probably one of the magical languages. At least they have constructed it to sound like to give the sort of history that it is. And I think that we'll just assume for the space that it is. Another thing. Okay. So, Joshua, are you following me?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, if you tie two gnats together, do you get a knot? I just but actually, I do have a few items here.
Sure, let's go through.
I've been reading. Whenever you were talking about the circular language written in a circle on a palm leaf or whatever, it got me thinking about the incantation bowls that they find in the Middle East, buried in the foundations of homes, particularly though at thresholds. And so I was thinking of the threshold saint kind of thing. Um, and so it says here, what I'm reading, when placed upside down under each corner of the house, demons would follow the inscribed charms that spiral from the outer rim inward, only to be caught in the center. And says they were commonly placed under the threshold, courtyards, and in the corner of homes of recently deceased, and in cemeteries. So it was reminding me too of where you were talking about the corpse magic and those sorts of things. So I really do think it's axial. Like there really are some parallels, I think, with some of this stuff. It's just not always exact, you know. I was thinking too of when you're talking about Mercury magic, as its role in all this. I do have a friend that's a practicing Buddhist, and he once gave me a parad, which he said had been, I think it was Mercury bound with something else, and I guess it had the ability to, bound with cobra venom, I think it was, or something like that. But anyway, I always think of that thing when we're talking about Mercury and tantric traditions. But yeah, thanks for letting me talk about that incantation bowl, because in that same article, it was also talking about knots. And so, there's knot magic as well. Hey, yeah, there's another good example. So I just was kind of humored by the parallels there. So thank you for letting me comment on that.
No, thank you, and thank you for letting me go on for 40 minutes, Joshua. I appreciate that.
Oh, it really been that long?
I didn't even feel it, to be honest, but I
Yeah, that was
guess.
the flow then.
So you can see, I mean, I agree with you, Joshua. Like, look at the bottom seals, the circular seals at the bottom. Those do look very much like Pentacles of Solomon. I could pull up various Pentacles of Jupiter that look very similar to the last two. There's one that even the one on the end, there's a pentacle of the sun that is broken into like an iron cross. That looks very similar to me. And of course, Hebrew is a magical language. So of course there is a similarity. They're obviously understanding the word as foundational, as primary, as magical, as a vehicle to carry forth invocation, evocation, thurgical. Although Buddhist doesn't, I try and use post-surgical to describe Buddhist magic, but I know not everybody really understands what that means. So I think that it's important to just say that it's not necessarily dealing with magic, and not necessarily dealing with spirits in the way that a Western magician would understand. But this is actually a yant that they would use in anti-colonial wars. If you've ever heard of the Boxer Rebellion in China, they would use Maoshan magic, which is a kind of southern Chinese magic, so maybe even more closely related to Burmese yantra traditions. But they would write sigils and seals using Hansa Chinese script on vests made of yellow mulberry fabric, sometimes silk. And they would use it to protect against bullets. So this one is to protect against being mortally wounded in war. So it's like a vest, kind of like a Mormon undergarment. Very similar to that.
Dude, I was thinking about that. And also I was reminded of the myths surrounding George Washington, how they said that he was bulletproof and the bullets would never hit him. And so he was so, the natives were so awe-inspired by his seemingly invincibility. But yeah, maybe he was wearing a tantric garment underneath.
Well, why not? Why can't we posit that they were? We know that they were members of various Hellfire clubs, of the Freemasonic orders, and this was before like very rational Freemasonry, right? Like as a Freemason yourself,
you
like you kind of know about this.
Yeah, I mean that's where if anybody had that stuff, it would be them. I guess you're right. So yeah, that is possible, and he's high ranking, right? So he was like head of a lodge and everything, and head of the country. So. And as a colonialist, he would have had ties in, because I was thinking of how the trade relationships between these places and how culture exchanges between them. So I think that maybe when we see these parallels, it could be because of the tributaries, if you will, of culture that flow in and out, across the borders.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and we're going to save that. We're going to return with a V. We're going to return to that point of colonization because that's a big. I think I could probably go on for 40 minutes just on that topic alone. I won't, but we're going to revisit that. I'm just going to finish quickly the gnats, and I want to tie in the idea of incantation bowls because I thought that was a really excellent point. So, as I said, the gnats were. The list was condensed. So you see this a lot in magic. You see this with the Goetic spirits. You see this with the Jewish angelology lists. They were often huge at first. Like when they first appeared magically in wisdom literature, the lists were extremely long and sort of rambling and not necessarily deeply corresponding to, like, it wasn't neat. It was like, I've called it before on the spaces, like low IQ syncretism or low IQ correspondences. I'm not saying that the original scripts are low IQ. I'm not even jokingly saying that. I'm saying as they were the first iteration of this sort of reoccurrent, that's what we're going to say, reoccurrent axial knowledge, they were not neat. So later scholars, later sages, later rishis, later practitioners, later monks, they revised the lists. So a famous Burmese king, this is going to be an important discussion, like what is a king in the Southeast Asian context? It's much more similar to a wizard king, like a Platonic wizard king, than to any kind of conceptual idea in the West, maybe outside of England, where the king was possesses a kind of divine power through God. But this is not quite the same thing because these are invested with the power of the spirits, so the gnats, but they're also, because they're Buddhist, they're also invested with a higher power that is self-cultivated. This is the big difference between Asian magic, I would say, if you want to. I don't like the East-West dichotomy. I think it's a little art-hard. I'm just being honest. Hard R. Because as Joshua said, I think that the fluidity and the cultural sort of trade routes and the conceptual barriers that we sort of create for these places to interact, I think is a lot more dynamic than we give credit for. That's just my personal opinion. But the Asian magic, if you want to say anything about it, it has a lot to do with self-cultivation. This is true of Taoism. This is true of Buddhism. This is true of Tantra, whether it's Indian Tantra or Buddhist Tantra. This is true of all basically magical traditions in Southeast and East Asia, is that requires cultivation of the mind. It requires praxis of the body, of doing something, of meditation. Number one, as I've always said on this space, I've always encouraged everyone to pick up meditation because that will be your primary seat, ground, practice of magic, whatever you think that is. So there was a famous king in the 17th century who was said to possess all the powers of these knots. He realized that what had been added to the knot list over time were not just beneficent spirits useful for the state ritual worship, like to maintain the kingdom. He realized that various demons, various sort of negative entities and maybe even foreign gods had come into be worshipped. And when I'm saying foreign gods, I'm not necessarily talking about any deities that people would know about, but I'm more referring to tribal deities. Headhunting, like there's a lot of Karans. We actually have a friend of our, well, he's not a friend of our group. He is part of our Grey Lodge, Leo, who I also think is my friend. So he is a half Karen, and so they had a very ferocious cannibalistic headhunting culture at one time. And so their spirits would likely sort of represent their values, right? And you also have to think that Burma, even in a tantric, like a Central Asian tantric conception, was called the Naga land. So the place where the Nagas dwell. Obviously, Burmese pythons, everyone who knows me knows I'm much more like Indiana Jones. I absolutely hate pythons. I hate snakes. I don't hate cobras, and I don't hate any Ophiophagous snakes. I'm fine with that. Snakes that eat other snakes, like very Moses. I'm very cool. I like black snakes from the south because they eat other snakes, especially poisonous ones. And cobras in Asia actually eat a lot of pythons and monitor lizards. Nagas often take expression as cobras, and that's the primary species of Naga. But Nagas can also take, there are subspecies of Nagas that take python form, crocodile, and monitor lizard. These ones are considered to have much more spiritual power in the material world, whereas cobras are considered to be the kings of the Nagas, the rulers, and they have much more spiritual power in the subtle world, the world of the spirit. Okay. So he realized that the grouping of knots had become sort of outrageous. So he condensed it down to 37. Of course, this is a magic number, three. So you could say it's 777. You could say it's 37, which is 10. 10 is the Buddhist sort of resolution to the paradox of numbers, the one and the zero. Zero, again, I've said this many times, is not nothingness, but it actually is the zimzum, the potential, like a womb. It is the expansion and contraction of the infinite, of the universe. So it is the female principle. That's why you can liken it to a womb. So the zero is never nothingness, especially in a Buddhist context, especially in a tantric context. So 37 is a very magical number, just in general. So he condensed the list to 37. It has a variety of spirits, as I said. Some are real, some real as in historical. Some are literary, meaning that they could or could not have existed. They might just be a sort of thought forms on the page that took on a form of popular worship. They can also be Weizza, meaning wizard saints, people who were historical figures and magical sort of Buddhist practitioners, as well as kings, queens, and various animistic household and village and mountain spirits as well. But it also includes these various Vedic and Puranic deities. So that's basically all.
So you could say he had a naughty and nice list, like Santa Claus, Saint Nicholas. See what I mean? There are always these parallels.
Well, okay, so that's honestly it's a good example, Joshua, because I knew you knew it was, but it's a good example because it does show that the kings in these kingdoms play a hugely important role in religion and how it is institutionalized and like how magic is sort of the backbone. We'll get into this, especially when we do our next Southeast Asian space, which will be called Dukun, which is set in Indonesia, because the kings and queens of Java and Sumatra actually were wizards. They were Weizza in their own way. So, and we'll talk about that when we do that space. But I think that again, it parallels this king. So he was a magician king, a sorcerer king, we'll call him. So you cannot really separate magic and statecraft, especially in this context. So yes, he did have a naughty or nice list. He deeply considered, probably with counsel of like various monks and other Weizza, he considered what would be in keeping with like what would propagate the state, what would help the state, what would keep the state stable. So you would have to admit that the worship of like a figure, Chandika, whose name means shining one, interestingly, but her more common Indian name is Durga. This is really interesting, and you might find this interesting, especially Joshua, is that her name, it actually means fortress, like Netzach. But it specifically refers to a star fortress. It can be a 7-pointed star, or it can be an 8-pointed star. Very interesting. And she can also be said to be the primary goddess that arises when the 7 or 8 goddesses of the Pleiades cluster or the Big Dipper, can be both, fall to earth. They form into one sort of body, you could say Vajra body, and they become Chandika. It's very interesting. So she's a star goddess who represents a star fortress who is linked to the diamond of eternity. It's kind of interesting. So she would be a specific protector for the state. As well as I said, Indra is the chief of all the gnats. He is in control. He is the ruler of all the gnats. He's in control of what they do. If they do evil deeds, that is on him. That is on his karma. So in many ways, he functions as a tantric figure, very much like a Mahakala. If you've seen me on Twitter post pictures of deities, you will see that they have retinue figures, lower figures, not necessarily lower as in bad, just lower as in more worldly, under their feet or on the earth beneath them. And those represent their activity, their sort of manifestations in the carnal or worldly form. So, so all the gnats are specifically chosen to sort of help keep people harmonious, help keep the state stable, and help protect the people within the polity.
You know what that reminds me of is generally doctors or these professional type careers. They'll have people under them, like a physician's assistant or nurses, etc. They practice under that doctor's credentials, right? So in that same way, I was kind of thinking of that whenever you explain the Indra relationship.
That's a really good metaphor, Joshua. I agree with that. That makes a lot of sense to me. You would absolutely have to say that that is what it's like, especially with the Weizza. Now, we're going to go back. So Weizza is not a gnat necessarily. Of course, a Weizza can be a gnat. We was Weizzas. Okay, I see you, Joshua. That's quite funny. That might turn into a Twitter post later. We'll see.
Yeah.
Probably. But anyways, a Weizza is not a gnat necessarily, but a Weizza can be a gnat. But the Weizza cult is different. The Weizza cult, again, focuses on these Buddhist wizard saints that are living people. And it's important to remember that, yes, they do possess or said to have possessed or said to possess actively these cities. Cities are not necessarily the same as magical powers as we would understand them. Is it? It's not like Harry Potter. It is the power to one of the powers is atomization, so you can actually become less dense, so you can pass through solid materials. One is bilocation, meaning that you can travel to multiple places at once in both your physical and spiritual body. One is visitation by dreams, which we covered. Another one is, yes, there are ones that cover fire, like the ability to create elemental projectiles, I guess we'll say. Some are more mundane in the sense that they're clairaudient, clairsentient, clairvoyant. Those are very common. X-ray vision is another one. So you have to look at the list and see them, but they're human. That's really important. And this is a very Buddhist way to understand. They are still human. They are still human in consciousness, human in their lifespan. But they have attained spiritual power. So when they pass into Bardo or when they pass into samsara, the ocean of samsara, they maintain a degree of control over where they go. And perhaps they have developed and built up through these magical practices karma to go higher than a samsaric rebirth. So I know I said incantation bowls, and we are getting to incantation bowls. So, I think Joshua is totally right. I mean, exorcism is you absolutely cannot discuss Weizza or Lursi or Dukun or any of these practices without specifically talking about exorcism, because exorcism plays a huge role in the manifestation of these people in the village context where gnat worship is more popular. Now, when you're getting into urban worship, the Weizzas become more popular. Why is that? And exorcism also becomes less important. It becomes more about mundane magic, love, money, protection, victory over your enemies, things like that. Of course, healing and exorcism are very important and perhaps the foundational sort of meat of what a Weizza really does. But I think, once you're getting outside of the village context, a lot of the things that are ascribed to spiritual illness become psychologized. Now, it's really important that Burma has resisted colonization in the last 50 to 80, I think 80 years. So they were formerly ruled by the British, but they had, interestingly, this is actually really interesting. I always found this interesting in university. When Burma was occupied during World War II, they were occupied by the Japanese. In fact, they, unlike other Asian countries, now this is not all the same. This is also the same. I mean, it's not this. A lot of the times the Japanese were reviled as the new colonizers. It's a very common Chinese way to frame um, Japanese occupation. And that is true for the, places that were predominantly Chinese or largely ethnic Chinese. Of course, Burma is a hugely there's a lot of Chinese Burman, like Burmese who are ethnic Chinese, tons. And in fact, they comprise a lot of the royal family. And as we discussed last time, um, there is no modern nation state really without the Hokkien, Hakka, and Cantonese traders. There's no modern Thailand. There's no modern Cambodia. There's no modern Laos. There's no modern Burma without the sort of Chinese ethnic and financial influence. So to say that it's unimportant is wrong. But in Burma, they were in a unique position that they hated the British so much that the Japanese were sort of viewed as liberators and they were welcomed. And this is also true in Indonesia, actually. So yeah, they viewed the Japanese as liberators. They said, okay, we're throwing off the yoke of the British. Now China was undergoing its own revolutionary politics at the same time that this was happening. They did not want that either. This is something that I think is really interesting, and it directly ties into Weizza. So this is exactly when the Weizza cult was really really fomenting. It was part of that revolutionary anti-colonial politics, but it wasn't just anti-colonial against the West. And it wasn't even anti-colonial against the Japanese, interestingly. It was anti-colonial against the Chinese. They did not want, and this continues up till contemporary time, they did not want to be part of the Sinosphere. They did not want to be part of the communist bloc. They wanted Burman sovereignty. It's extremely important part of the sort of Weizza doctrine, even though it's not really a true doctrine as in like written down and codified. But if you read the Thomas Patton book, as well as the various other books on the subject, of which there are not that many, every modern Weizza, every modern Buddhist wizard, they rejected Chinese rule. They were very much in favor of Burma or Myanmar as a nation state of its own, of a kind of, I guess it is a very closed off nation state. And I think this is the sort of situation that they all preferred. And this is also interesting because in our early Grey Lodge days, of which Joshua, of course, was part of, we talked a lot about how maybe the metaphysics of the kingdom, whatever you understand that to be, but the Malkuth is at best and at most founded along the continental lines or the lines of a kingdom, the borders. And you cannot really control outside of that. So I feel like this is a Kabbalistic and maybe wisdom science thing that is perennial or primordial or axial that comes up a lot. Like, how much can you control? Where is your sphere of influence? Where is your sphere, like your locus of control? So,
well, if I may,
Joshua, go ahead. Absolutely.
I'll just interject real quick by saying, like, principalities and things like sometimes spirits have like domains of control, and so maybe there's an aspect there to take into account, like when limitations of Malkuth come into the picture.
I love how you put that, limitations of Malkuth. I think that's a very, very good way to put it. Because what are the limitations to Malkuth? The limitations to Malkuth are really the cartographic boundaries that we draw, but cartographic boundaries are often not arbitrary, which speaks to something else that you're saying, sort of the spirit's areas of control. Like I said earlier, A lot of Tantra, Central Asian, Tibetan Tantra, looks at Burma as a Naga land, a place for the snake spirits. Now, of course, as I said, they have various, and very important Naga cults of crocodiles, pythons, cobras. The Naga cult is impossible to get away from. I even used image of it um, as the title card for this episode. So, um, maybe the Nagas are constricted to this like area which spans a huge, like, Burma's a big country, and it's largely mangrove and largely jungle. Interestingly, I think something, it doesn't necessarily go along with what you said, Joshua, but it does is something I wanted to bring up, and maybe you'll find like something interesting in it and you can riff on it. There's a story about Crowley actually sailing into Rangoon from India. And as the story goes, he rented a donkey and traversed his way through this thousands of miles of jungle to reach into Sichuan in China. Now, if you understand the actual history of the region and the cartography of it and the geography, this is almost certainly fictional. It would have been impossible for him to do it. He would not have been able to do it on his own. The jungle is one of the thickest in the world. Like it's almost like entirely unexplored, especially then. It's also the region of the Golden Triangle where they still grow tons of opium to this day. Very important, and it's an important resource for the junta. And it's part of why Burma has always retained such a strong degree of isolation, because a lot of the, like the US and China kind of respected that Burma has a claim, the largest slice of the pie, to the Golden Triangle, because that's mostly in Burma. Of course, it's partly in China, partly in Thailand, partly in other countries, but the Golden Triangle is largely in Burma. So there's an interesting kind of weird parapolitical, maybe magical story about him traveling through this impassable jungle with giant snakes. And when I say giant snakes, I mean giant snakes. Like they're huge, like massive. Like there are pythons that are much bigger than the biggest crocodile you've ever seen. So we're talking about things that could easily eat a person and a donkey and no problem. So for this, like a white guy, from the UK, who's like chubby and a drug addict and sweaty, I just don't see it personally. Like this is a malarial area. This is a dengue fever area. This is a yellow fever area. No pun. I just can't imagine him doing it. This overland route to China, which takes 3 months, by the way. So again, there's a lot faster routes. Why wouldn't he just go to Thailand or go to Vietnam? There was a train from Ho Chi Minh City. The French built it, that went into, I think, right on the border of China. So there was a lot easier ways to do it. I think this is a bit of parafictional or metafictional story, magic making, mythopoesis, etc. But I think that also speaks to the idea of like, what is the nature of Malkuth and what are its limitations? So you have to say that partly what Burma is, because it's a mangrove is a swampy place. There's the swamp is always tied into this primordial ground, this primordial land, sort of the place where we arose, as from if you want to believe like a apocryphal story, we arose as like a slimy swamp things, and we became human over time. So it's usually set in a swamp, and certainly this is the part of the Gnostic story, the primordial grandmother, the Chandika before she is Chandika, she arises in a swamp, the primordial swamp. So a mangrove is not quite a swamp, but it's close.
What came to my mind as you were talking about that is how some cultures associate, like I saw a little whirlwind of air the other day, like leaves and stuff. A lot of people would see that as like some type of air denizen or spirit, right? Water springs and where water's churning, those sorts of things. So I think maybe there's something to why we our cartography, as you said, those boundaries, those natural boundaries of rivers and mountains and things like that, are where you find concentrations of these dakinis, if you will, for lack of a better word. And maybe that's where they live, and they kind of ward off us in a sense. So whether we're really aware of it or not, in a sense, that could be true.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you, 100%, Joshua, 110%. Is that there clearly are spaces that are occupied by spiritual forces. This is even the story of Tibet, like when Madame Blavatsky said she went into Tibet, if you understand the Tibetan sources, it was impossible because it was very much impassable because an evil spirit, so she isn't necessarily evil. In fact, she's Chandika. So she is actually the spirit that we're looking at, depicted very differently, depicted very ferociously in a Tibetan context. But she guarded the kingdom of Tibet, and that pass between Nepal to Tibet was always covered in a very dense fog, as well as accompanied by storms, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people went missing. Now, sometimes the British did attribute this to certain cult activity from Kashmir or from West Bengal. Obviously, the Thuggee comes to mind. I'm not quite sure how historical that cult actually was, or if it was very historical. I'm not sure. There's a lot of speculation. I think it's a largely sort of mythopoetic story, taking real elements, things that were actually real, mixing them in with British sort of, we'll call it British empirical sociology. So even if you just have a basic idea of what sociology is, or you don't really know what sociology is, very, very, just to reduce it down, and maybe this is basal, and I know that people who have sociology backgrounds will no, a lot of them know, but some of them will be a little upset with me, but that's fine. Sociology was invented by the British in India to facilitate ruling over diverse populations. So you have to sort of think that sometimes, well, okay, magic is often contained in narrative and contained in beliefs, meaning the more people believe in a narrative frame or a narrative angle, the more power that story holds, whether that story is true or not true. So that's what I'm kind of saying about the Thuggee, is that
Well,
whether it is true or not true, it describes something that was happening.
may I ask a
Absolutely. Sorry,
question?
Joshua, I didn't mean to interrupt
No,
you.
it's cool. I didn't realize you weren't finished yet. Do you think that this had an influence on the creation of the caste system? I'm not entirely familiar with the culture.
So this is a very contentious issue. It's a great question, to be honest. It really is a great question. So there are castes in the Vedas, there are castes in the Puranas, there are castes in the Upanishads. It clearly existed as an Indian idea. Now, did the British reinforce the caste system? Yes, that's also true. Did they sort of concretize and more formally codify it in British law? To a degree, yes. But they also did the other dialectical maneuver, which the British are very fond of doing, playing both sides, right? They would pass certain things to make sure that that demographic, very sociological, would have voting rights, would have enfranchisement, because it disrupted society, right? You can't, if everybody's fighting each other, how can they fight the colonialists? How can they fight the Magians? It's a good question, right? So, a lot of Southeast Asian countries also have formerly had a caste system, which is to a degree exists and not exists. Now, this is interesting because it goes back to the idea of Chinese admixture. If you are mixing in mercantile, ethnic, foreign DNA into the elite population, well, China never had a caste system. So these people don't have a caste positionality except for being Merchants. Merchants are just a middle caste. They're not particularly high and they're not the lowest. So this obviously also disrupted the sort of at least Southeast Asian caste system. But again, because Burma was ruled by the British, you would expect to see certain demographics elevated over the others. So this comes back to the question of like modern Myanmar versus Burma. So the name Burma actually refers to the majority population, which is about 65% of what is contemporary Myanmar, are Burman ethnicity, Sino Tibetan, directly related to Tibetans and distantly related to ethnic Han, ethnic Chinese. However, again, because of this more recent influx of actual Chinese ancestry, meaning like 2 generations or shorter, into these elite populations, again, you are looking at like a rapidly changing sort of face of what a modern Burmese person looks like and is. So if you're familiar with like Aung San Suu Kyi, who's by far probably the most famous Burmese person on earth, she has significant Chinese ancestry. And she also, very interestingly, especially to me, especially to the Grey Lodge, since we did coin collectively the word Hapaborean and did a 5-part series at least on the subject. But she has Eurasian ancestry as well. And this is also part of British colonization of Southeast and East Asia. It's very different from India, although, of course, because I am a bit of a Havaborean scholar myself, like I love the, historical mixed race communities. I think that's a very interesting place of inquiry. I always have, is that there are Anglo-Indian, Anglo-Sri Lankan, and, various other British admixture populations, British Creoles in Seychelles and Mauritius, and et cetera, of course. But the Anglo-Burmese, which are Hapa, like me, kind of, except that they're Hapas who marry other Hapas. So their kids are Hapa, but they're not really Hapas. They're Burmese, they're Burman, but they're Anglo-Burmese. These were the ones who became the higher ranking people within the social structure. So I feel like maybe I sort of meandered into that topic, but I feel like it's interesting just talking about like ethnic Burma, ethnic Burmans versus the sort of tribal, outcast, rural population who are a lot more brown, just to be honest. So I think it's like an interesting note about caste and like ethnicity and race and religion, but of course it is a largely esoteric Theravadan society. And I would say it's still esoteric Theravadan, even though some people would posit that esoteric Theravada has died out because largely it's much more, it's not really underground. And we discussed this again in our Lurcy episode. It's not really underground. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Thai amulets, Thai yantras, Cambodian yantras, Cambodian amulets, Cambodian tattoos, all of that. That's a Burmese everything. It's all very, very important to Asian culture, pan-Asian culture, not just Southeast Asia, but just Asia in general. This is like you want to talk about like a sort of industry that nobody talks about, the magical Buddhist industry of Southeast Asia it's a huge economic importance for people at every rung of society. You could say that in a way, magical Buddhism transcends caste and even ethnicity. So the Weizza of urban Burma also have these kinds of like links. They're not necessarily Anglo-Burmese, or they might even be from villages or whatever, but they are predominantly Burman, so part of the ethnic majority. They also all have, or the majority of them have, ethnic Chinese ancestry, maybe distant or maybe more recent. And some of them do have Eurasian ancestry as well, like 1 or 2 ancestors. I'm not necessarily saying they are Eurasian. I'm saying that they have an ancestor, just like I have. One of my grandparents has a Eurasian ancestry. but doesn't mean that themselves are Eurasian, sort of like Bruce Lee. He's not really Eurasian, but he kind of is. So it's like that. So I think that you're also looking at like a very modern kind of polity that is evolving. And so I think the magical traditions evolved. But okay, so we'll go back to this idea of like Japanese colonization. So they welcomed the Japanese, kicked out the British. They didn't want the Chinese. And so they sort of the early founders of modern Myanmar um, gathered together a sort of council of Weizza, a council of wizards, Buddhist wizards, as well as high-ranking monks who perhaps were also Weizza or just magical people in and of themselves. And they decided on various changes to the country that they would be able to maintain their sovereignty and stability. One of these things was actually to change the name from Burma to Myanmar. So you want to talk about like how much influence these magical practitioners, the wizard saints, had over what is a contemporary um, nation state. They suggested to change the name, and they did. And Myanmar is an inclusive name, not necessarily inclusive as in like we in the West would understand it post 2020, but it's a it refers to the multi-ethnic polity rather than a specific ethnic formation majority within it. So there are various other things, like in 2017, a group of Weizza also suggested to the military junta to change the direction of the side. Well, okay, the military junta felt the country was going in too much of a left wing direction because nominally it is a kind of socialist republic in a way, but it's really its own. It's its own ideology. It's kind of North Korea in a way. It's not similar to Juche, but there's elements of it that are indigenous. We'll call it. Okay, so they felt like the country was going in too left wing a direction, and they actually, on the advice of various Weizza and fortune tellers, now there is a distinction here, which we're going to get into, but they changed the side of the road that people drive on. They changed from the left side, the British way, to the right side, the American way, because they said it would actually tilt the politics of the country to the right. Very interesting. Now, as I said, a Weizza is not necessarily an astrologer, and they aren't necessarily a fortune teller. There is overlap, of course. Some Weizza do practice tantric, well, I'm calling it tantric astrology, but it's really about sigils and invocation of the lunar mansions and like making the yantras. Okay. Whereas sort of regular Burmese astrologer, again, they're ethnic Chinese or ethnic Indian, or they're a woman. They are practicing more Indian kind of Jyotisha, kind of regular astrology, excuse me, or Chinese astrology, which is more lunar based. So they are not necessarily practicing the same. Their wisdom science is more public. So this is really important because you see this a lot, like the amount of sort of gravity and importance that the Weizza and like even the fortune tellers, though, like I'm saying that they're not the same as Weizza, and they're certainly not, but they're given a high degree of respect. But this also can be a problem, right? Because you have Weizza who become very attached to certain, like they're patronized by certain well-off members of the junta. Well, there's factions even among the junta. That's what's really important and really interesting is you have pro-Chinese factions, like Chinese influence factions, and pro-American faction. Among the ruling junta itself, you have a division. So this also happens among the Weizza. You have Weizza who take the position of being pro-America, and you have the position that some Weizza are pro-China. So if you listen to our other space on apophenion, even if I didn't really mention it that much, I think I mentioned it once, but there was a wizard war in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, that coincided with the Gulf War. If you listen to Peter Carroll, he calls it the Ice War. It was between him and another chaos magician called Frater UD. They had this ice war where they were sort of gathering in dark circles in London, and obviously Tracy Twyman does come up in like the later iteration of this sort of ice war. But you have these kind of meta political groups of wizards who were fighting supposedly on the astral plane or on the hyperspace kingdom. That's more my language. Um, in these kinds of webways, they were having psionic battles, influencing the way the war was both understood by the general population, so a kind of quote unquote mind control from these wizards, but it's not really. It's more narrative framing, more using writing and fiction and metafiction all blended together. But there is a psychic and a psionic component, at least if we believe what Carol said. So and then there was another faction. There were other psychics, wizards, whatever you want to call them, who were uh, sort of engaged on the psychic battlefield in the Middle East and partaking in the battle and the sort of strategic plans to make sure that they were successful. So this basically happened in 2020, and they arrested various fortune tellers and Weizza for belonging to the wrong faction. So, but this is not new. This is not new at all. This is part of Burmese culture. This is part of Burmese history to a very high degree. The factionalization of the Weizza from its origin as being an anti-colonial pro-sovereignty. And this is something really interesting is the Weizza, because of the rigorous nature of training to become a Weizza and whatever methodology they use, obviously the primary methods are Buddhist and maybe the foundational methods are Buddhist, but of course we listed several that are tantric. A lot of this is about personal sovereignty, about personal locus of control, the controlling the primordial ground, that which is your own mind. So you must also say that it makes, as Joshua said, like what are the limitations of Malkuth? You are Malkuth. How far can it extend? Well, as we posited, maybe it only extends as far as the geographic boundaries, cartographic boundaries allow. Maybe those cartographic boundaries are also ruled by the spirits that are innate to the geographies, very geontology, something we've also discussed a lot on these spaces. But maybe the spirits are tied into the geontologies, as Joshua said. Like a swamp is going to be full of nagas and these kind of very ferocious yakshinis, dakinis, non-enlightened dakinis, but very ferocious kinds of spirits of nature, yakshas, yakshinis. That's just the feminine evocative ending. So yeah, I think, and the mountain gods and their retinues. And so you can bring all these in, and that's an idea of Tantra, right? Is that you can bring all of these entities, these spirits, these spiritual forces, whether they have their own animus or anima or not, you can bring them all into Dharma. So that this is a big part of what the Weizza did originally, and perhaps why they weren't so highly worshipped in the past kingdoms because they were really functional shamans or functional wizards, practical wizards, like practical Kabbalah, like the Baal Shem, the priests, the Kabbalistic priests, who would do like psalm recitation, exorcism, same things that Weizza do. Um, they would go out and tame these yakshas, these dakinis. As I said, exorcism is very, very important. But as your civilization grows, it becomes less important because you're dealing with less of these intrusive spirits from the nature, and you're dealing a lot more with interpersonal. If you want to call them spiritual forces, that's fine. I'm fine with that. But you're dealing with a lot more like civilizational spirits, we'll call it things that exist within like the city, within the polity, within like the natural formations of humanity. And of course, Tantra has a preoccupation with the Mahasmashana or the carnal ground, as well as the refuse pile. So then there is a Nat of the refuse pile, as there is also a Bodhisattva, as there also is a Dakini who resides on the refuse pile, because all of these things can be brought into, as I'm saying, into Dharma, but also into the polity itself. The spirits are also subject to the Wizard King. That's a big part of this, a big part of the understanding of Weizza and what their role in society is. They are not just for personal salvation, like you don't just pray to them for personal salvation. You don't just pray to them for magical powers. You don't just pray to them for intercession. They're actually to bring you into the greater harmony of your life. Like Eros would describe it as alignment. So if these spiritual forces and wizards themselves are agents of the sort of metaphysical state, then what they do in intercession is also help you align with that. That's one idea. I'm just positing this as a speculative idea, but I think it's true in a metaphysical way. Like they were to tame the spirits and bring them into the kingdom. So I would say that that's a very important part of what the Weizza are and what they did. And as we move into like the urban polity, we are talking more about mundane human concerns. So the monastery is less important in modernity. We all know this, we understand it. And even in the sort of Burmese conception, they call it the sasana. Well, this is a really interesting Pali word that is also very similar to the Burmese word. Again, Burmese has a lot of Pali loanwords. So sasana is what we would call in Sanskrit the sadhana. So the path or the praxis or the practice, all of those things can be understood as that word. So the sasana is really more, they understand it more as a more East, we'll call it Eastern, even though I said I hated that dialectic prior. But I think it's interesting because when they're saying sasana, they're actually meaning the way, like more of a Taoist way, or what I would call the marga, the path. They believe that the Weizza and the Nats themselves are to help you come into the Buddhist Dharma. Even if they're a black magician, even if the Weizza is like an evil sorcerer, all of this exists in a samsaric way, right? So all of what we do, our actions implicated by karma, they believe in karma, I believe in karma, so I'm just going to use that framework. They all of that is part of this greater cosmic story. And so if you are brought into the sasana or the sadhana, you are actually furthering your good karma, positive karma for a higher rebirth. So you do find black magic Weizza. It's not as common as in Thailand. Of course, the more outside of the major cities you go, Burma is a very underdeveloped nation in general. It has a middle class since the 90s. But it is, it's still a very underdeveloped nation. As I said, it's still mostly jungle. That's really what Burma or Myanmar is. It's a jungle. It's a deep, deep jungle. Like one of the most pristine parts of the rainforest, of the Southeast Asian rainforest, still there. Teak forest too. So, I mean, you definitely see jungle practices, jungle magic. Just like in Thailand, we talked a lot about this. Like, what is the difference between central Thai magic, Bangkok magic, and this Lana magic from northern Thailand? Well, quite a lot. And so, but because Burma is so thoroughly Theravadan, even the village practices, the jungle magic is still informed by this Nat worship, which is Buddhist, even in small degree. It still is Buddhist. And it's also informed by Weizza, which is fundamentally Buddhist. So that's also really interesting, I think. And so, where was I even going with that? Well, I think I'm going to bring it back around to incantation bowls because Joshua brought that up and it was such a great point. What is an incantation bowl? Well, I'm very familiar with them. Joshua's very familiar with them. Babylonian incantation bowls. They're not all Babylonian. There's many Semitic, Northwest Semitic ones. A lot of them have invocations to various saints. When I'm saying saints, I'm also referring, yes, to Old Testament prophets, especially to Moses and Solomon. You see them very frequently, especially in the Levantine incantation bowls. So Moses, why I'm bringing up Moses and Solomon is because if you think of them through this framework of Weizza, are they not Weizza themselves? Are they not great wizard saints of the Bible? Yes. All Christian Hermeticism, as well as Christian Kabbalah, as well as practical Kabbalah, as well as like hoodoo and all of that sort of syncretic American folk magic, if you want to call it that, they see Moses and Solomon both as great wizards. So you must also understand that we're not talking about something so distinct here. So you see these incantation bowls will have invocations to them as well as Mary. Well, that's really interesting because in the earliest days, even though she is not a goddess, and I would reject people who would say that she is a goddess, she functions much like a mother goddess, much like Chandika, who's on screen right now, much like the mother of all the Dakinis, like the mother of heaven, the queen of heaven. That is an epitaph, a title of Durga, very important title. She is the queen of heaven in that pantheon. So she's part of the incantation bowls. So we're finding parallels. Then we also see invocations to Lilith, to Pazuzu. Why would you invoke Lilith? Well, you would invoke Lilith there are two reasons. One is to curse your enemy. So if they cross the bowl, meaning they cross the threshold, if you bury it under the threshold and underneath the threshold of someone's house, this is very common. They would go in the middle of the night and bury one of these bowls under a threshold of your enemy's doorway. So that person would be cursed as they cross the threshold into their own home. But so Lilith would be invoked for that. And Lilith is also invoked for the return of black magic. Very interesting because she is the cause of black magic. So she can also be invoked as the return. Now, when you find these Lilith bowls, very interestingly, she's often paired with Saint Michael the Archangel. So you have these who can be a left-handed angel. I'm just saying, people don't think of it like that, but he can be. He can be syncretized to Samael as well. So he's kind of an angel of both hands. And so it would make sense that you would pair such a powerful force with this very antinomian transgressive force to give it a kind of balance. So the magic wouldn't return back on you, or that you would send out the magic that someone had put on you, the curse that someone had put on you, and you would obviously build up not only defense from St. Michael, but also domination of your enemy. So the combination of the two is very powerful. Why am I saying that? I'm not saying that Indra is the same or is in any way aligned or alike or parallel even to St. Michael, but you do see his invocation on yantras. In fact, I have an image. I'll bring it up. If Joshua wants to take over for a second, I'll put one up on screen. But I think it's really important that these figures, it's not just like they're deities or spirits or gods. I mean, they're especially not gods. I mean, yes, Chandika is a goddess for sure, but she also represents a being in Dharma. So it's more of a spiritual force. It can be understood more as an allegory or more as a process of consciousness, if you want to use really Buddhist kind of way of framing it, or even just as a phenomenological reality. Anyways, Joshua, say something smart so I can bring up this yantra of Indra quickly.
Okay. Earlier, when you were talking about I think it was Chandra, the one associated with the 7 stars of the Pleiades, and you said she was maybe associated with fortresses, and it reminded me of something from, I think it's the Bible, in Book of Daniel and Revelations. There's a scripture in Revelation 6 verse 13 where stars fall to the earth, and it kind of reminded me of what you said there about the Pleiades doing that. And then of course the figure known as the Antichrist is supposed to be associated with something known as the god of forces or fortresses, and it's supposed to be a god that his fathers did not know. So it's like from another land or something like that. So when you're talking about this, it just made me think of Durga or Chandra or whoever it was you were talking about earlier.
Look, I think that there's a case to be made that a lot of these stories are in common throughout the world. Not saying they're exactly the same. They're different interpretations, different cultural and spiritual understandings of it. Is everybody having Sephirotic experiences while there is every, Are they having Sephirotic experiences and experiencing direct revelation, or are they just remixing stories that were common at the time? I think it's a bit of both, right? I think that's what makes text um, important and also flawed. That's why I always say, like, for our Grey Lodge spaces, and you know this, Joshua, is like since the very beginning, I personally think people can, of course, do what they will and what they want. And I've always emphasized this idea of personal sovereignty as well as conscious autonomy as a space. I think that's like one of my most deep seated things that I believe. But I believe that you should always read wisdom texts non dually, number one, Bodhicitta framework, number two, middle path, number three, and also non literally as maybe a subcategory. You cannot understand them as being directly one to one related to anything else or even material historical history. Of course, they can be, but it is interesting to think of it as these greater myths that actually are aligned, much more closely aligned in the sort of thread of humanity than people recognize. And whether they're talking about the same entity or a different entity or a sort of different iteration of the same story, a kind of wavelength, a waveform, a sine wave, maybe it just repeats. Maybe it's a rhyme. Maybe these are echoes. Maybe these are echoes on the Aethyrwave. That's one idea I've discussed with Solar a lot. Like, are these perennial or primordial or axial ideas? And we've also discussed it just broadly as a group. And in the spaces, especially. Like, if you go back and listen to all of our episodes, I think you'll hear that it's an axial space. Like, I definitely, whether we say it's real or not real or just speculative, I think that absolutely it is these are things are closely related. I would say. I would argue, I'd go to the map for that. So, anyways, this is the yantra of Indra. So you can see king of the gods, and so it says a protective yantra. You can even see the little sigil at the bottom looks just like a Malkuth. Has a letter in each quadrant. I don't know what it says, and there's a threshold under his legs. Very interesting in a way. But yeah, so you can see like they take these deities, but it's not necessarily like the Indian idea of the deities. It's not necessarily like them as like, oh, we're going to worship these god forms. It's more that they're using the vessel or the husk of them or the image or the sigil of them, their representation, maybe metaphysically, and they're utilizing their properties to bring about magical acts. But even the creation of a yantra, like the making of one of these sigils for paper or for the vest, like we looked at before, or for a tattoo, the sigil design is one of the hardest. They say it's one of the hardest and most fundamental part of Weizza, of wizardry. And so sometimes Weizza will come up with their own sort of sigils, but they have to study the palm leaf manuscripts that have come before. They have to become a master of sigil making, of the sort of ancient or archaic sigil making from the past. And there are very specific kinds of rules regarding the creation of these sigils, as well as like what they can depict, the geometry, the maths in it, and as well as the sort of deities or spirits invoked by them. And like the astrological days that they're drawn on, the sort of ritual purity of the Weizza who makes them, the ritual purity of the Weizza when he tattoos them, and the person being tattooed themselves. These are all subject to ritual concerns. So that's very interesting, I think, as well. Something I guess we did discuss how the Weizza are fundamentally part of the kingdom. Now, they are also factionalized. Like, yeah, we discussed that. I think we were quite thorough in it. But I do want to say something that I found really interesting, which I've touched on several times, but I think that perhaps didn't fully flesh out, was the the anti-colonial origins of the Weizza cult coinciding with its popularity is kind of I was thinking, like, if we look at it through like a neoliberal, post-capitalist, whether Burma has ever been capitalist or not, I mean, that's an argument. I would say absolutely, because you have people driving private vehicles and owning private homes. So there's an element of it that is obviously capitalist in nature. You don't have a middle class without capitalism. There are private factory owners, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, it's all entwined with the state in many ways. It's a military junta, right, with the socialist sort of leanings. So, of course, there's a lot of corruption and entwinement. This is true for everywhere. I'm not picking on Myanmar in any way. Um, I think, though, that because of like this kind of alienation and individual, sort of false individuation of the sort of neoliberal order, people again fall very much into these personal concerns: love, money, job, school success, because they're Asian, obviously, um, and magical concerns like defeating your enemies, whether they are your business rivals or some like mother-in-law, because it can be both, right? So it sort of devolves into these personal concerns. But if you have a direct intercessory spiritual cultus, meaning the Weezzas themselves, and the Weezzas themselves, as I argue, sort of turn you back onto the sasana, the path, the sadhana of Buddhism, it's also a corrective. It's kind of paradoxical. People turn to the Weizza for worldly concerns, but the Weizza themselves are Buddhist figures, so they hopefully turn the devotee towards more, even if it's not a monastic or a lay practice of Buddhism, which is fine. It doesn't have to be either of those things, in fact, but it turns them on to Weizza practices, which are again fundamentally Buddhist in nature. So, but it is magic. It is sorcery. It is to help people resolve issues of the world. It is meant to be very much intercessory. It's not meant to be just, oh, I gain magic powers and I can walk on water. That's one of the cities. And so I'm going to do it to impress to impress large crowds. Now, Thomas Patton, in fairness to him, Dr. Patton discusses how he comes across several fraudulent actors. Well, he understands them to be fraudulent, whether they are or not. I don't know. I didn't meet them, but he understands them to be fraudulent, and I agree. And he's a very fair assessor of these things in general. Like he takes everything kind of as an anthropologist, but he's also Buddhist, and he's also living there for 20 years. So he does kind of understand the Burmese sort of worldview. So I think he's a good arbiter of like people who are faking it. And of course, you can't really talk about fraudulent and con artists without discussing social media. So this is something that we encounter a lot in the Grey Lodge, or at least me personally, is the idea of fraudulent practitioners. So very frequently, so we'll stick to the text for right now. He encounters two particular instances. One is a female medium. She doesn't say she's a Weizza. She says she is a medium of Bo Mingguang. I'll put him back up on screen right now. There we go. So she says that she is his medium, meaning that she channels him and she speaks in his voice. And like that, he even describes her as speaking in his voice while she's smoking multiple cigarettes. So he asks her, since he is a biographer of this saint, that's his, like, I think he wrote a whole separate book on it, as well as I think it was his doctoral thesis was on this guy, Bo Mingguang. So he asks her a series of several questions about his life and about like where he lived, who his parents were, et cetera, and she didn't know any of it, although she was speaking in his voice. So that's really interesting. And then another time he encounters like an old man who is a well-known like wizard, sorcerer, healer, cursor for hire. And it's not necessarily that he is a fraud per se. It's that he talks a really big game. And it just is almost so unbelievable that, and with no sort of like backing materiality to it, that the Thomas Patton is very skeptical. So why is this interesting for right now? Because with the rise of these kind of con artists, spiritual frauds, et cetera, which have always existed. That's not nothing new. This is nothing new. This is the tale as old as time. The Buddha, even himself, the historical Buddha, obviously discusses this exact thing. He studies with hundreds of rishis, 108 rishis, lursis, shamans, wizard, Weizzas, all of these different ethnic practitioners, magical people, Vedic sort of reciters of these proto mantras, et cetera, astrologers. He knows they all exist in that, in the Nepal, in that Nepali valley where he was from, which interestingly also borders Burma. So I just feel like it's the idea of a spiritual fraud is not new, but because of like modernity, it's perhaps easier to pray directly. Again, very intercessory, direct revelation, direct intercession. It is easier, and this is a lot more tantric in a way. You can pray directly to these higher elevated, I'm using this word, but I'm not necessarily using it in a theosophical way, but these ascended masters. You can just pray directly to them as your guru, as your own personal teacher, and they will intercede in various ways, but their primary way is to put you on the path of becoming a Weizza yourself. So I feel like this resolves some of the paradox of spiritual frauds. Because if you can have a personal relationship with one of these wizard saints, then how can other people claim to borrow or draw from their power? Right? Because you already have a relationship, so you don't really require a secondary character. So I think that resolves one side of it. But then I think also the Weizzas, again, because they're Buddhist and they're drawing specifically from Buddhist sorcery, regardless of if they're doing Buddhist sorcery or necromancy or black magic or whatever distinction you want to make, which they are allowed to do as they are lay practitioners. And perhaps if you agree with me, they are also tantrics. So they can do what they want to do. And they have multiple ways of thinking about why they're doing that. And I'm not saying it's all skillful, all upaya, all good. It's not. They're still human. But I think it also it counters a lot of the fraudulent magic, and not just fraudulent magic, but like just because someone knows a little bit of black magic and curses their neighbor. Well, having a relationship directly with the Weizza, instead of having to run to some monastery, because, not every monk's a magic monk. And this is one of the really important parts of this series on esoteric Southeast Asia sort of Buddhist magic, is not every monk is just like a magic person. And this is something that I feel a lot of even Western Buddhists get wrong. They will look at every monk as being like of the same quality, the same skill, the same level of consciousness. That's not how it's understood. Just because someone's a monastic doesn't mean anything. A monastic can be many Buddhist stories about the worst kinds of criminals becoming monastics. That doesn't mean they don't change. Of course they change. Maybe they become very devout. Maybe they become, completely changed people. And that's also part of the story, a lot of the stories.
That reminds me of when I would go to the Catholic Church. Any old priest, people would just flock to them after the mass and just beg for blessings and stuff. And I always thought it was so strange because coming from like a Baptist Protestant background, you never saw anything like that. Unless it was like private, like, we need you to pray for our family or something like that, but it was just kind of comical to me, like how frequently people would flock to these people. So when you're talking about this, that's what kept going through my head, because I thought, well, any old schmo can become a priest, so like, it kind of almost makes you think too, like personal responsibility for your own magical hygiene, if you will, or spiritual hygiene. Like there's certain responsibilities that you yourself should take on, right? Not outsource them to these charlatans or whatever, so that you're not as easily taken, right? Anyway, I just want to throw in my 2 cents about my experience.
That's a legit, a great point. And I'm so glad you brought it up. I'm serious because I mean, we're very in sync, I think, on our spaces and stuff. Like we've done this so long together, but absolutely. So if you, I don't, you probably didn't read it, but there was, we read well, didn't assign it. I don't want to say it like that, but I said like if you want to read this book, it's by a lay scholar. She has a master's degree. I'm not saying lay scholars and like some, you know, it's not some like random from Timbuktu. She wrote a book called Esoteric Theravada. Okay. And so basically, it's about how a lot of the esoteric sort of Theravadan Buddhism went underground because of certain Protestant reforms enacted by both the royalty of various Southeast Asian countries, as well as the colonial, I guess, ruling elite in those countries, as well as by the monastic authorities themselves. They adopted certain Protestant reforms that were to crack down on this like rampant, I'm going to pretend like just because I take the robe, but then I'm going to go sell my services as like this guy, this wizard, um, a Weizza, but not a Weizza in the actual way, but Weizza is in like by reputation, a sorcerer. They're going to sell their services, but they're also a monk. So a lot of the reforms, like whether you agree with them or not, they were meant to cut down on this fraudulent behavior. It's exactly what you're talking about, like treating everyone that is wearing a frock or the collar as some kind of magical intercessory figure. I mean, that is not really the Catholic idea either, but inevitably, because of how degraded certain institutions have become, it people's consciousness also, in my opinion, becomes degraded as a reflection.
Well,
So
and if you think about it too, that attitude of venerating the smock or whatever it was called, the frock, uh, that then provides the fleece by which a wolf can wear. If we didn't have that attitude toward the clergy, then there would be no position of power to attract the psychopaths, as it were. So I think it's kind of funny how, in a sense, we almost create the conditions for which it will happen, you know.
well, this is a really interesting discussion again because it like brings up like what is a Weizza and what differentiates them from a monk. So Theravadan monks have very rigorous. The rule list for them is like hundreds of rules. Like I'm not even exaggerating. It's like very specific. It's like very ascetic. It's like Shramana in the ultimate sense of the word, asceticism. Now, Weizza, obviously, as I said, they occupy a third positionality. They're outside of it. They're tied to society, and they are also tied through Dharma, through Buddhism, to the monastic system. But they are not subject to those same rules. It's much more similar to Tantra, where they're subject to their own set of rules, their own set of conditions. So I think this is also explained by like I think that what you're saying also makes sense in the terms of the Weizza cult, because you're going to worship people who people know, and that's part of what becoming a Weizza is like these people had, according to cultural memory, living memory, because if he died in 1967 or 1957, there were still people alive, right? There were still people alive who have seen him, who encountered him, who have stories about them, and even if they didn't themselves see them, their parents or grandparents definitely did, because these are like national iconic figures. So there's a kind of reality to their magic, to their supernatural powers, to their wisdom science. There's a kind of truth to it, rather than just venerating the robe or the frock or the collar. They're actually venerating the living memory of these people and their powers. It's kind of interesting. It's very interesting for me because it kind of goes against how I would like to understand the world, but it kind of also makes sense to me at the same time. I'm just going to say there is a paradox, but it's interesting.
It reminded me too. There's a story in the Bible. I think his name is Simon Magus or something like that. Like he was following the disciples around, and he was begging them to teach him how to perform miracles and such. And at one point, they do start talking to him, and he asks them, "What can I pay you to learn this?" And it was in that very moment that they disqualified him altogether, because the fact that he thought you could pay for it meant uh, he wasn't even a vessel to receive it. Another, I guess. So it just came to mind there.
Right? And that's a great Gnostic figure to bring up for this space, Joshua. It's really great today. Okay, Simon Magus. So there's a whole Gnostic gospel about him having a magical battle with Saint Peter. They fly around. I forgot if it's Rome or Jerusalem, somewhere like that. And so they fly around and doing magical things to each other, greater and greater feats, until Simon Magus runs out of mana, you could say, and is defeated by Saint Peter. Okay, so yeah, this is very common. The magical battles among Weizza, the real, absolutely real. Whether this is just hyperstition, they just like have a rival, or they have oppositional forces against them. Like, people get jelly sometimes of like people whose renown is growing. Again, these are national sort of heroic figures, even in life. So of course there's going to be rivalry, jealousy, etc., etc. So yeah, they often encounter rival sorcerers, rival wizards, and they have to fight them. What is especially interesting, although the whole allegory was interesting because of the wizard saint nature of the space, was the idea of payment. Okay. So we talked a little bit about at the very beginning about how the Weizza are propitiated with cash, money, alcohol, especially cigarettes. They love tobacco. This might be a universal property of all spirits that they just love tobacco. Tobacco obviously has in almost all indigenous to North America cultures and African cultures as well, tobacco has the property to empower spirits, make them more real, make them more visible. They love it too. So it's a very attracting for them. But basically, the Weizza are propitiated with these transactional kinds of gifts and offerings. This is also true when we did the Lurcy space, when we talked about like the Maynok, the ghost cult of Thailand, which is it's not exactly the same as the Knot worship. Obviously, the Knot worship is more animistic, more Vedic, more eclectic. It's not really comprised of ghosts necessarily, more saints, or higher figures. But a lot of this kind of magic can be transactional. So can Weizza, I guess what I'm trying to roundaboutly say is, can Weizza take payment for their services? Well, obviously, yes. They are not like Naropa. They are not supported. They are not wizards supported by the monastery and its rich patrons. They have patronage outside of the monastery system. Sometimes this has been kings. This has been, obviously, we talked about the military junta having favorites among the Weizza specifically, and among fortune tellers and astrologers in particular. But absolutely, sometimes they are supported by people. Sometimes the Weizza were said to wander between villages and accept like offerings from the village, but not payment for their services within the village. This is not always the case, but this is the case for several of the Weizza, all whose names I can recall their prayer cards, but I don't know all of their names. But this is a pretty common story, I would say, is that they would accept community support, but they would not accept individual payment. Now, this is not always the case, just like with the Bo Mingguang, who's on screen right now. He would accept personal payment. Now, like in death, he would also accept payment from cigarettes. Remember, Burma is a isolationist country. So they were not getting, Western cigarettes on the white market. They were getting Chinese cigarettes on the black market. So it's like prison currency kind of. So if he was a heavy smoker, This would make sense. People would give him cigarettes. They would have to procure it from the black market, whether that's expensive or not expensive, still somewhat dangerous to get. So they would give him that, or they would give him whiskey. He loved whiskey, supposedly American whiskey. So how are they getting that? Well, that's very interesting, because you wouldn't even have that if you didn't have the American bases all throughout Thailand and the Philippines. That's obviously how they were getting it. They were importing it for the military junta, because all of those guys are pretty rich, as we talked about Golden Triangle money. I'm not even making a judgment. But they obviously, the military junta obviously allowed parts of the black market so they could get what they wanted as well. So he took whiskey and he took all alcohol pretty much. They drink a lot of what they don't call it toddy. That's an Indian term, but toddy is either a coconut or cashew rum. You can make rum with both of those things. And so they make like a local coconut wine or cashew wine, and it's extremely alcoholic. It doesn't taste that good. It sounds amazing because it's like cashews plus coconut. You would think it tastes great, but it actually tastes like really bad. Like it's moonshine basically. So he had maybe a more high-minded, more refined taste. So he liked American whiskey. So you see that in death, like, and then they also give him cash. So there were clearly times where they do accept cash payment. Maybe, and there's a lot of Buddhist parables about this, and I said it right at the beginning. Sometimes um, rich people would patronize the Weizza, and they would accept payment, because why wouldn't you? If that's what the people have to give, that's what you accept, right? So is that immoral innately to accept cash payment? No, of course not, because it's for a service. Now, this also invites frauds. This is what is really interesting, and this is one of the paradoxes that I find myself wrestling with, because I don't offer any paid services. I don't want to, and I probably never will. I mean, I never will offer services, but even in the nature of the podcast, the channel, and of all the work that we do, I just don't see myself monetizing it, unless it was like, if we were getting like 50,000 views a night, then obviously it's something I would consider, right? But just keeping it as like a small or esoteric e-zine, that makes sense to just like keep it like free to the people. It's kind of like psychic TV. We're just like discussing speculative ideas, speculative Kabbalah, speculative Tantra, speculative history. And we're just keeping it real over here. So
that reminds me,
Joshua, go ahead.
Like whenever I give mushrooms to people or whatever, I don't like to accept money for them. To me, because I was sitting here thinking like, well, why? What is it about the money thing? Like, what does it do to it? And I think somehow it must. Is it like how maybe money is Malkuthian in nature, and maybe some of these services or other things that can be done by the Weizzas, the cities, if you will, emanate from other Sephiroth. And so if we bring money into it from Malkuth, it almost like pollutes it or stagnates it or draws it down maybe. And so I think to like keep it at that higher level where there's an exchange, because if you take money out of it, well, now I got to perform a labor, or I got to get you a thing that you like. And that's how spirits are too. Like certain spirits like certain things, right? So I think that's more angelic in a sense, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Because I kept just trying to think of this guy. I was like, oh, so maybe he aligns with a certain spirit that happens to like tobacco and alcohol, or something like that. But money, however, I think that one like maybe gets in the way sometimes and corrupts the great work, if you will, or whatever. That was just a thought I had in my head. Thank you.
Sorry, Joshua, that was a great point. Please don't apologize or say that. Just a thought. Your thoughts are quite important. I always find use in like you saying them. I think tonight you've been exceptionally good with like where you are thinking. I think that's exactly right. I think money Malkuth. I wrote it down. I was like, yeah, that's very insightful. It's good Kabbalah. You've gotten so good. It's like I don't even expect you to be like, I just expect my expectation of you is high now. I mean, it always has been pretty high, but I know that you've gotten so much better. So I'm not really even impressed when you say things that I find really interesting. I'm more just like, yeah, That's very insightful. So good job on that. But
Thank
you
you.
know, you're welcome. But I try and keep it real myself with that stuff. Uh, because I am always impressed by, whenever we all grow in terms of knowledge and our understanding and it's just our greater articulation of wisdom. I think that shows it shows our strength as like individuals and as a space. So I really appreciate that. Um, and it makes me look cool, of course. So, you know, but yeah, Money Malkuth, I absolutely agree. I think it's bringing it down. I think it's like distillating it, like you said, it's bringing it into the material grounds. It's not letting it be elevated. Of course, there are times where you do that. Like I said, with the rich people or with royalty, maybe you would accept gold or gems or certain things. Maybe you could sort of negotiate a higher vibration of exchange in certain circumstances, but just cash money directly one to one for Weizza services. Now, if we're talking healing, there's probably a question where we could discuss like the morality of taking payment. But if we're talking about, because they're Buddhist, right? So there would be obviously a question of like morality and karma, but then also curses. So this is really interesting. There are Weizza who don't take payment for curses, but they'll take a coin, one coin. This is common throughout all of Latin America, throughout the Americas, throughout the Caribbean, throughout Africa, throughout the Arabic world, the Southeast Asian world. Most spiritual practitioners who do perform curses, they don't always want to do it just for money. In fact, a lot of the time it's like a kind of a challenge to see if they can do it. So what they will do is to sort of alleviate, we'll call it karmic concerns, is they will take a small payment of a coin from the person so aggrieved by another party, and they will do the curse on the basis of that. And then if they are successful, then they will go back and ask for a greater payment. It's pretty common. I know this is very unconventional for Western thinking, but I also think like maybe perhaps both you and I, even though I'm Asian, well, half Asian at least, we maybe put our Western conception on like our Western. I'm just saying, I'm not saying that we are doing this, but I'm just saying that even the way I'm thinking about it, maybe it is a more Western conception of like the transactional nature of magic. And maybe our like morality is like much more tied into the, Jesus as a sorcerer, more like where he's like a white sorcerer, you could say, maybe. And so he's just performing the miracles out of goodness of his heart. And a lot of the Weizza did that too, as I said. It's a conditional, a lot of this is conditional.
You reminded me of a story in the scripture where Christ is asked about paying taxes or something like that. And I think he tells somebody to go to the stream, the nearby river or whatever, and grab a fish, and there will be a coin in its mouth to pay the taxes with. And I just thought that was a really funny story. So yeah, that maybe he was practicing some type of wizardry there.
Like there are so many parallel stories, like parables and folk tales and extra like heterodox sort of like biographies of these wizard saints, like doing very similar things or resolving issues. And like to bring up the Solomon, like King Solomon again, one of the things, yes, he is a great sorcerer and he, conquered all the angels and all the goetic demons and put them under his control so he could build the temple, et cetera, et cetera. That's obviously sick and awesome and like one of the best parts of his whole story. But if you actually read his like the Songs of Solomon, a big part of that gospel or that book is that, I guess it's not a gospel, but a big part of that book of the Bible is him being an arbiter, a judge for like very mundane cases that serve as like moral parables. So that's honestly what the Weizza would do as well. They would go in, solve village disputes. Okay, so one farmer says his neighbor stole his cow. So the Weizza would then go in and perhaps ritually perform ways to test if the cow was indeed the, accuser's like cow. sometimes in the stories, it's unclear if the Weizza is actually doing any kind of magical ritual or whether it's performative, kind of like wink, wink. We are just doing this as like a thing, as like a kind of social supplication, so we can actually make a judgment with some supernatural authority rather than just saying as a human, okay, this is our opinion. So it seems like some of the time that that was true. They would do kind of like woo woo bullshit, like weird things, but very like tongue in cheek. They would clearly know what they were doing. But it would be to solve these everyday things or say, okay, the village headman who's always a little richer than the rest, right? Maybe he gets a ring stolen. So the Weizza then performs like a finding spell. This is very, very common among all these practitioners, like finding lost things. Very important. And so maybe he does, or maybe he also does detective work. That's also what the Weezzas would do. They would go around interviewing all these different villagers, like the toothless grandma who's like chewing the beetle nuts and the lime powder on the porch, and then he would go like talk to the kids playing their, it's not soccer, but they use these little rattan balls, and they kick them. It's really cool. It's I can't do it. My dad can do it. But anyways, the they it's kind of like soccer though. But anyways, he would go interview them and did different things. So it's like a lot about solving social problems, but in a semi-magical way. So like a kind of magical sociology, if you want to call it that. So I mean, it parallels a lot with King Solomon. I feel like and they would also intercede, like talking about like working with the state or working for the village. They would often intercede. There's a lot of stories, not about this Weizza on screen, the Bo Mingguang, but some of the older ones. They actually interceded on behalf of the village to the state. They would say, this is unfair. This is like, this village is under hardship. They're under famine. We can solve the famine with our magic, but you can't then take away half their rice because they will starve. So you see them doing things like this too, which again are partly magical and partly practical. Because to solve a drought, that would be considered under the sort of office of the Weizza, is like the comptrollers of the spiritual forces, or at least intermediaries. So yeah, that's a big part of what they would do. Now, the more you get into this like alienated individual, where someone's going to be like a black magician and they're going to sell their services on Facebook. Oh, this is what I want to bring up. Social media has made these modern practitioners extremely popular and extremely expensive and extremely competitive on social media for clicks and views and, of course, sales. So I think it's not like I obviously support everyone associated with me and our group in their endeavors, if that is Etsy, if that is services, if that is whatever it is. I think I'm pretty good about that for the most part. And I have no problem with people doing that. I think that if you offer a material services, you should be properly compensated. There's no I'm totally for that. People should own their own labor. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people, just like we were talking about with Weizza, who are fake. And social media allows for a lot of these people who aren't necessarily, I'm not saying that they're all fake or they're all, set out with bad intentions. But if your sort of inclination is strictly financial, even if you're a good Weizza with powers or with like, it doesn't even have to be like gross powers. It could just be like you're a great fortune teller and you're a Weizza and you're learning and you're in the process of learning how to, do your Buddhist meditation / sigil making / alchemy / exorcism things. But you're just like, you make your bread, you make all of your, you make all your bread doing services like fortune telling or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's obviously going to influence like the ways that you then um, both interpret the fortunes as well as offer other services in the future, right? I prefer people not to offer magical services, if I'm being honest with you. I know that we've had people loosely associated with us in the past who have had magical services. I'm not particularly fond of that. I find it to be I just prefer people to offer material things like card reading, astrology. Those are all things I can 100% understand, because it has a material wisdom science foundation. So people can refer back to them, and it doesn't necessarily rely strictly on the practitioner's interpretation. It can also refer to the person who's receiving the reading, right? Like they can look at the cards later on and say, this has particular meaning in my life for right now. So there's kind of a reciprocal or perceptual interaction that I agree with. Whereas if you do magical services, even if they're very efficacious, you can just tell people you've done magical services, like I was saying with the village arbitration. And it's not always wrong. It's clearly correct. It's clearly there was the right thing to do in those cases. To just like spit some mumbo jumbo, being like, "La, la, 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 la," you know, pretend you're channeling the spirit and then being like, okay, well, you stole his cow. That clearly makes sense. But then there's a time where it's like nefarious, where it doesn't really make sense. So this is obviously a big part of like how to negotiate like Southeast Asian ideas of religion, ideas of magic, and ideas of Buddhism. I would say that the most famous Weizza, well, all of the most famous Weizza, the ones who are regularly venerated in the sort of Weizza cult, they were it's like they are all very mixed personalities. Some are extremely pious, some are like very close to like a Buddhist or a Sufi or one of those, and they're like fighting demons and like healing the sick and like doing this and this and this. And some are like Bo Mingguang, who's like has a very volatile personality, who is consorting with kings, who has like who loves beautiful women, who has magic powers, but you never know what side of him you're going to get. That's also true too, but I would say that it's all a mixture. Like if you're seeing someone who is like, if one of the Weizza, they all have cured the sick. That's a big part of what being a Weizza is. They have all like helped the poor. That's a big part of being the Weizza. They don't help wicked people particularly. That's a big part of being like a venerated Weizza. Now, of course, there are Weizza who are black magicians. We already have said that. But the ones who are the most important, or the ones who are canonized, are definitely people who have much more of a social or like benevolent orientation. So just like they're more inclined to the state. But of course, under neoliberalism, they can factionalize and they can sort of lose their marga, lose the sasana, lose the way, lose the path. So I think that's always fraud. And I'm not trying to say anything about like people who sell spiritual services, but I do see it as a big problem. I don't even like the idea of teaching people for money spiritual services. In terms of like, oh, this is very popular. I'm sure you know about this, Joshua. It's like a lot of people do spiritual classes or start spiritual universities. If I'm speaking really frankly, I think that's all bullshit, personally. I'm like, first of all, if you're going to do magic, at least do magic for your fucking self, number one. Like, if you're going to just engage with it, start there. Then maybe you can consider writing a book or something. But I don't like this idea of these like online spiritual academies, that just really are setting book lists and recording videos by content creators who already make videos and write and do video essays. Like, to me, that's bullshit. You're just creating more content to hide more content behind a paywall, and you're taking like double the money, basically, a monthly subscription fee. Someone wrote a great Twitter thread on this, like the new kind of capitalism is subscription capitalism. So the more subscribers that you have, the more it's like I was laughing to myself today. I was like, it's the passive income summer. But like there is kind of nothing better for a content creator than to offer a course that people continuously are buying that once you've set it up, you no longer have to really engage with. It's
And
kind of
dude,
like,
it's not even just in the spiritual community. My friend, she'll pay as much as like $4,000 or $5,000 to some health coach to basically tell her what to eat and what to do to work out and stuff. And I just think that that's crazy, in my opinion. But she's done it more than once. And it just, so it's in every field. There's a sucker born every minute, I guess.
no, there absolutely is. Because this is the thing, is in a pre-modern society, you have a thing called community or public knowledge. And in like this post-modernity, you have this, we have only individual and institutional knowledge. We don't have a public or community knowledge. So that was what the internet used to be. It used to be very much about public knowledges, about going to different websites and like reading different things, like Crystal. Like Crystal's a great friend of the lodge, obviously been on my show. She's an herbalist. She should get paid for her labor. She should get paid for her book, and she should get paid for her ideas. But then there's also like the thing where she puts a lot of that shit out for free. She puts a lot of that shit out on Twitter, and so do a lot of herbalists. And so that's obviously a big part of it. But then you find in the herbal community is not free of this at all. In fact, it's actually one of the most rife with people who strictly want to sell books and as well as workshops. Because you can't really make a living as a community herbalist in 2026. You have to do something else. You're either selling tinctures or, which is a very material thing. So obviously that's great if you're selling high potency, like tinctures that you're like self-making or whatever, but that's a lot of fucking work. It really is. For some, I've made many tinctures. It's a lot of work. And like, especially if you're doing spiritual style ones or spiritual oils, I've done that too. It's a lot of work. Astrologically, personally, financially, it's like a huge investment, and it's not like when I'm just doing it for myself, that's fine, but it's still like it's a very resource intensive thing. But you see a lot of herbalists doing workshops or teaching like these like long modules of like thing. I won't say who. There was a famous feminist herbalist who kept having meltdowns. Who knows the herbal community will know exactly who I'm talking about. But she kept having meltdowns at these senior students of hers, and she kept her school very like hippie dipshit, but it wasn't. It was all about like money and power, really, which is basically one of the big problems. And maybe I think in Asia, the idea is like a great master doesn't necessarily have to be a great person. And that's okay. And it's really about his like greater whatever. It's about his greater benevolence to society or to people. Maybe just to people, like on a more individuated basis. Magnanimity. Thank you very much, Joshua. I appreciate that.
Means generous and forgiving.
Yes. So you should be like that. You should cultivate your, bodhicitta or hesed. I agree with this, but that doesn't mean you have to exercise it in the same portion for every person. But I also think like this goes along with the idea of like teaching courses, because you and I have discussed this so many times on spaces and on the show and in the group and privately and everything. But like that Gevra is one of the Sephira of the great teacher, because it's the discernment of wisdom in that space of understanding that you have to be Hasidic, but you also have to give and restrict students who are at different levels, not because you're being mean, but because you actually want them all to come to a greater understanding. So you have to tailor the lessons to like for high achieving students as well as the ones that are a little bit behind. That's a great Gevratic that's one of the greatest powers of Gevra, is that like discernment to be a teacher. So I think spiritual services are a lot like this. I think it's like, do you just do it because you're looking to make money? Or are you doing it because there's like a greater sort of purpose for you to have like spiritual services on offer? Like, I'll just say for me, if I like, depending on like the, I guess, danger of it, but if I was like asked, and I would never be asked to do this, but if someone asked me to like perform an exorcism, I would not be comfortable taking money for an exorcism, because that's like a spiritual battle, right? Like, that's a spiritual battle, whether I like, like between, if you want to call it good and evil. I try not to use those kind of Manichaean terms, but it's about people in the spiritual world. You're acting as intermediary to balance, to be the Tiferatic force between those two polarities. So I don't know if I would accept for that. But if someone was like, could you do a little love spell for me? Maybe, I don't really do that, but I'm just saying, like love road opening. Very simple, gentle. In Hoodoo, it's considered white magic. There's no problem with it. You're not drawing someone specific. You're just opening the roads to possibility and potentiality. Very Gevratic in a way. So I would have no problem. Like, I wouldn't do that for someone. I'm just going to be clear about it. Please don't DM me asking me. I would never do that. I'm just giving an example of where someone could accept barter or transaction. But I don't want to place like great morality upon it. Like, I don't know. I think it comes down to context and like the specific instance. And so I think this is what, to bring it back around to Weizza, and we'll close out in 2 minutes here. But I think it comes back around to the Weizza and looking at them and seeing in their hagiographies or their biographies, their willingness to negotiate dependent on context and dependent on circumstance. I think that is the mark of a great saint, rather than to say it is all one thing all the time. They have to be perfectly shamanic. No, they're not monks. They don't have to be perfectly shamanic. That's not the rules of the game. The rules of the game are that they adhere to their tantric rules, whatever those may be, prescribed in those texts, the palm leaf manuscripts or the tantric like little fragments that they have or whatever. There's a lot of writings in Burmese that are very similar to tantras. I've seen them on, if you want to go to the School of African and of Oriental and African Studies, it's called SOAS, SOAS. Go look at those and go to that website, excuse me, and type in palm leaf manuscript, Burmese, or just Burmese manuscript. And if you have any background, you don't even need a background, just go to my Twitter, or you don't have to go to my Twitter, go to the Himalayan art website, go look up yantras, then go look up these Burmese palm leaf manuscripts. There's such a deep similarity. So as long as they adhere to the tantric rules, they're cultivating their meditation, because that's their foundational practice, right? Meditation. What are they doing in meditation? Well, they might be doing magic, but don't worry about that right away. Just focus on meditation. But anyways, like they're rounded people, and as long as they're following their rules, it's not really important how we understand it, is how I'd like to say. But of course, we're going to place our, preconceptual ideas onto them. But they are kind of, as I said, they're linked to the state, but they're also kind of individuated. They're also kind of their own people. They have their own ideas of the world, and they want to, their purpose was to, at least in the Weizza cult, is to stay behind and help those who want to be helped, or who ask them to help. So, who am I to judge, the nature or morality of their transactional sort of veneration or their services? But I think for the modern practitioner, the idea of offering services is very fraught. And I do think that this kind of online agora, online university, private like courses teaching, like I'll just use an example that I'm familiar with at the moment is people selling like Dion Fortune. Like Dion Fortune is an exoteric Golden Dawn member. She's writing for she's writing for the public. She's not writing for the Golden Dawn to like repackage her text and sell it as a course. The whole point is for people to read it and sort of learn on the basis of their own, or then go to a magical order or whatever and sort of build upon that book knowledge or that book understanding, text understanding. It's not meant to be repackaged and sold. And just like with chaos magic, you can't really teach chaos magic. You can't really. Because chaos magic is sort of the deconstruction of the magical magical systems. You kind of have to understand a magical system first, in my opinion, before you can really start getting into the, you can't really understand chaos maths until you have more of a ground in metaphysics. Peter Carroll, he loved K-ball too. Wasn't his primary thing he wrote about until later. But he obviously, you can look at the internal documents for like their International Order of Thanatos and all of that. He's talking about K-ball all the time. That word even comes from him, even though I stole it because it's so good. But I'm crediting him, so it's okay. Pope Pete, don't get mad. But anyways, I just want to say that. Like, I think I see a lot of people who are not really metaphysicians who are making these metaphysical universities. And I'm like, I don't know. I have a big problem with it. Because I feel like what we've done is very far future minded, very future, it's kind of, we're kind of avant-garde in a way because in a way, we kind of taught a lot of people at least the introduction to Kabbalah. And certainly when we did the Dion Fortune spaces, we discussed it like very extensively. And when we did it again on Rejects, we discussed it very extensively. And when we do speculative spaces, they're usually based in K-ball to like at least 60%. So I feel like that's maybe more of the Omer, more of like the husk that contains the truth, or the sheath that contains the truth of Kabbalah, is like hearing people do it, hearing people like trying to make the apophenion sort of associations of it, and like the deeper understandings, not just being like Gevra fire red. Like there's so much more to it. And I feel like there's a lot of people who don't understand even that, who offer very expensive courses. And I'm not a big fan of that personally. But I am a big fan of the Weizza, and I am a big fan of Joshua. And I really appreciate that he stuck it out 2 hours and 37 minutes with me while I kind of monologued. But he added some really heavy and amazing points. And so I really couldn't have done it without him. I think this was quite a successful episode, at least for part 2. I think we will do a part 3 but we'll call it a part 2 of Lurcy, of the Thai series, specifically of Thai magical Buddhism and magical sorcery. Magical sorcery is kind of repetitive, but Thai magical tradition, because I think that there's so much more to cover, and I didn't even touch on the urban stuff, and I think I should have. But no, I think this was a great space. I really appreciate it. Shout out to Solar and Eros. They're always welcome to come when they're available. I never say that anyone has to come and has to listen to me. Sometimes it's much more of a far-ranging discussion. Sometimes we are really hitting the text hard, and next week we will finish Apophenion. Hopefully Joshua and Eros will be there. Solar won't be there, but I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone from the Grey Lodge who showed up. Vanessa, of course, Truth and Dies. Check her out on Etsy. Cassandra, our artist in residence / resident prophetess. go check out her Etsy, Spotless Mind Tarot. Go check out her jewelry on Etsy as well, and her IG. And yeah, thank you so much. I guess she does her content. Sorry, Sandra. She does content as well on astrology and on various things. Like it's like she does videos and she kind of drops them it's like very quiet. She like keeps it really quiet. Then I see it on the timeline, then I'm like, okay, share. But yeah, so check out Cassandra, check out Vanessa, check out Eros, check out Solar, and I'll let Joshua plug himself. He does have an part 2 for Elden Rings coming up on Threshold Saints in the next month or two. So I just want to plug that, but also go check out his part 1 with Seth, Bibliomancer, on the same topic. Well, it's sort of on the same topic. It's on Dark Souls. It's called High Guardian Angel. I know it's called Holy Guardian Angel. I said High Guardian Angel intentionally. So maybe one day we'll explain why I did that. But I actually had multiple reasons, but it was interesting and I thought it was kind of funny and tongue in cheek. So thank you guys. In terms of Threshold Saints, before I let Joshua close us out, I have an episode with Kyver Rose upcoming. I should get it out Sunday at the latest. I also have an episode with Solar coming up with CJ. So that will be all esoteric Buddhism, like 2 hours, like total autism of Tantra. So the three of us doing that. And then I've got so many episodes coming up. I have the whole crew of the AppCon, the Apocalypse Confidential online lit mag. I've recorded with 3 of the editors, so they'll be coming on. The episodes will drop hopefully sooner rather than later. I have a great episode with Brian Gathie from the Liminal Currents podcast, which is probably my favorite, other than Threshold Saints and the Grey Lodge, of course. Those are really my favorites. But other than those, my favorite is Liminal Currents. So yeah, he was a great guest and a great sport to sort of like he had never heard of my show, so it was kind of like he took a chance, and I appreciate that a lot. And yeah, so I've got lots of people coming out, lots of guests coming, and thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. There would be no Threshold Saints without the Grey Lodge, and there would be no the Grey Lodge without all the people in it, including Joshua, Solar, and Eros, and Cassandra, and Vanessa, and Crystal, and everyone else. So I really appreciate it. Thank you for allowing me to like do a metamagical project on the internet. I know I get a lot of shit, and like probably by proxy, you all do too. And but it's been really meaningful for me, and so yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you guys.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
Joshua, plug what you want to plug. If you want to plug okay and all that, that's fine.
Yeah, I just didn't want to talk over you. And thank you so much for hosting. I did record an episode with Chris from King of Cups, and that was a lot of fun. In fact, we'll be doing another episode here soon, so check us out on YouTube, channel KOK. I did enjoy those Elden Ring episodes. If you feel intimidated by the fact that it's a game, just know that we tried to do a good job of distilling it down into basically how the elements of the game are reflected in cultures and religions and things like that. It was a lot of fun to explore. So if you're a fan of the Soulsborne franchise, definitely give it a listen. And yeah, as always, it's always a pleasure to be here and sharing time and space with you folks. And I think this weekend's Father's Day. So if there's any fathers out there listening, I appreciate you procreating, and I'll be celebrating the solstice this weekend. So thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joshua. And your episodes on Dark Souls and Elden Ring are some of my favorites, like for the whole show. And we got an incredible response to the first one. Honestly, I got a lot of people messaging me being like, this is so good. Like, you guys did a great like Gnostic breakdown of the ideas of the characters, all the K-ball. Like, I listened back and I was like, we did really good. And when we were recording, I was like, is this going to be good? Like, I didn't know when we were recording, but when I listened back for editing, I was like, this is really good. And then when I released it, people kept saying it's really good. So I went back and listened to it again, which is I always do usually. And I was like, yeah, this is great. Like nobody's talking about video games, vidya, and like as a hermeneutic of reality in the same way that we are. So again, we're way ahead of the curve. Of course, people will emulate us. And that's also like how I know that the Grey Lodge and Threshold Saints is cool because when people copy us, I know that we're doing something right. Even though it annoys me and everybody knows it annoys me like hugely, I do know we're doing something right. So appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. Everybody meditate. Everybody do spiritual practice. This is not Kali Yuga. It is the Aeon of the fucking daughter, but you still have to keep up with your spiritual and psychic self-defense. Absolutely number one. That is your number one goal. You don't have to care about Weizza or Kabbalah or anything that I talk about. Or any of that, or politics, or anything. But if you take one thing away from the space, please meditate. Please have a spiritual praxis. Please, get your mind right. Number one, but then also like have a place that you can go that will help you in this very fraught carnal ground world. So, and shout out specially to Dawnlander. I know he didn't come. Well, he lives in Japan. So, Dawnlander, this was an episode specifically for you. I should have said at the beginning, but Weizza was definitely inspired by you. So thank you so much, buddy. Appreciate you, Lil Naga, and hope you're having your coffee espresso right now. I know you don't drink espresso, but like cafe au lait. So thank you, Dawnlander, who is a part of our Grey Lodge and a great friend to me. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Have a great night. Oh, fly one evil wings. Okay, there you go. It's because you change. I never know. Okay, well, there you go. Pink hearts. Okay, so I recognize you. Okay, so this was your episode. This was your episode, Cafe au lait Kid. There you go. So this special dedicated to you, Dawnlander. Even though I was very neutral when we discussed China and America and Burmese politics, but I think I did it in my own way. Okay. Thanks, guys. Have a great night or a great day.